Good morning and welcome to today's hearing on oversight of the Federal Communications Commission. At prior oversight hearings, I've stressed the importance of reauthorizing the FCC, something that hadn't been done in nearly 30 years. Reversing more than a quarter century of legislative action took time and effort, but I'm glad to say that with bipartisan, bicameral support, we've now accomplished this goal. Signed into law in March as part of the spending bill, the Reorient Act not only reauthorized the FCC, but it also included important spectrum, infrastructure, and broadband deployment provisions, including the Mobile Now Act, that will help pave the way for American leadership in the race for 5G. Under Chairman Pai's leadership, the FCC has also taken action in a number of areas to help free up more spectrum for wireless use, streamline broadband deployment, and bridge the digital divide, particularly in rural states like my home state of South Dakota. I commend the Commission for these reforms and look forward to discussing your vision for building on these important steps. Yet, as we all recognize, work remains to bring service to those areas that lack access to a viable broadband option. Among other challenges, rural areas of the country face continuing uncertainty and reductions in universal service funding. I appreciate that under Chairman Pai, the Commission has finally undertaken the long overdue task of trying to ensure adequate support for the deployment of broadband in such areas. Nevertheless, providers need certainty as they plan for the deployments that will bring service to rural America now and in the decades to come. Put simply, the Commission needs to act this year to address funding for legacy and model-based high-cost support. Looking ahead, providers also need access to additional spectrum in the global race to deploy next-generation wireless technology. As this committee heard just a few weeks ago, the United States is engaged in a high-stakes race with China, South Korea, and others for leadership in 5G. It's critical that the United States win this race and the jobs and investment that will come with victory. The Commission has made real progress with high-band spectrum, and we look forward to related auctions beginning this year. At the same time, the Commission must act quickly to make more mid-band spectrum available for 5G before we fall further behind. And as important as additional spectrum allocations will be for the next-generation broadband networks such as 5G, streamlining deployment processes is also critical. I applaud the Commission and particularly Commissioner Carr's efforts to remove barriers to broadband deployment. A number of states have adopted legislation to streamline the deployment of small wireless facilities, but the inherently borderless nature of broadband Internet access warrants discussion of a national framework. The Bipartisan Streamline Act that I introduced in June with Senator Schatz is meant to stimulate the discussion. Striking the right balance between accelerating broadband deployment and preserving local authority will be an ongoing focus of this committee. I look forward to hearing about the Commission's complementary efforts to accelerate deployment and how uniform national processes can help bring the benefits of 5G to all areas and not just those where the cost equation makes deployment easier. In the end, American consumers will be the beneficiaries of these efforts. They are and must remain at the forefront of the FCC's decision-making across its many responsibilities. For instance, it's important that the FCC put consumers first as the media landscape continues to dramatically change and grow. The FCC must also continue its efforts to protect consumers from fraudulent and unwanted robocalls, which remain among the top consumer complaints. Now that the D.C. Circuit has found many Wheeler-era Telephone Consumer Protection Act rules unreasonably expansive, arbitrary, and capricious, the real work of protecting consumers and restoring reason to TCPA rules has begun. Consumers must have meaningful rights to control who can call them using automated calling technology. We must also ensure that those trying in good faith to comply with the law and reaching their patients and customers have a reasonable means of doing so without facing potentially devastating litigation. And we must make sure the Commission and law enforcement have the tools and incentives that they need to go after the scammers and thieves bombarding us with illegal and unwanted calls. Finally, before I close, I want to acknowledge the unprecedented measures that the Commission has taken under Chairman Pai's leadership to improve the openness and transparency of Commission processes. Publicly releasing drafts of items the FCC plans to vote on weeks prior to doing so has made both the process and products at the FCC better and more available to the American people. The same applies when the Commission makes mistakes. Along those lines, a recent FCC Inspector General report about an alleged attack on the Commission's comment filing system found that, and I quote, "The FCC, relying on then-Chief Information Officer David Bray's explanation of the events, misrepresented facts and provided misleading responses to congressional inquiries related to this incident," end quote. As you know, it is absolutely critical that the information provided to Congress and the American people be correct. I look forward to hearing how the Commission will prevent such mistakes in the future. I want to thank our distinguished witnesses for being here today and for working with the committee on many of these important issues. And I look forward to a robust discussion. And I'll now turn to Ranking Member Nelson for any remarks that he'd like to make. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The FCC majority has certainly been busy in the last year and a half. You've been busy by abdicating the agency's statutory authority to protect consumers on the internet. You've been busy paving the way for unprecedented broadcast consolidation. You've been busy proposing to eliminate rules to make quality educational content for kids readily available on free over-the-air television. You've been busy gutting a program designed to help low-income Americans afford phone and internet services. The bottom line here is that the FCC has been busy removing consumer protections in almost every industry that you regulate. What we haven't seen is progress in actually closing the digital divide. Access to broadband is often the #1 issue in rural counties, like so many of the counties that I have just visited all across North Central and North Florida, as well as in urban communities. Floridians still do not have all the access to the affordable, high-quality speed internet service. And in these areas, students lack the ability to complete their homework. Small businesses can't compete, and social and political engagement is hampered. And these Floridians deserve the same opportunities as do Americans across America that other Americans have with high-speed broadband. And so on behalf of those Americans and those Floridians who are part of the 24 million on the wrong side of the digital divide, we need real solutions for getting quality, affordable broadband in those areas. And I hope the FCC will move with dispatch. It's going to take more than lip service to solve the problem. It's definitely not going to be solved by repealing essential protections to preserve the free and open internet. And I want to remind you, those rules were popular with millions of Americans and were upheld in their entirety by the courts. Now, you all are observers of the political scene. You know that a bipartisan majority of the United States Senate has decisively repudiated that action through a congressional resolution of disapproval, led by Senator Markey. That formal censure should give the FCC pause. It should spur regulatory humility in all actions taken by the agency. The American people expect more from our independent regulators. The FCC's actions directly impact the lives of so many. The FCC can make a difference when you focus on the greater public interest, not on fulfilling the wish list of a few large companies. The FCC has always had a supremely important role in our society, and we ought to be optimistic about the future, particularly as we go on and as you receive oversight by this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Or look forward to hearing from the members of our commission. We'll start on my left and your right with the chairman, Ajit Pai, followed by Commissioner Michael Riley, Commissioner Brennan Carr, and Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. So thank you so much all for being here, and we certainly look forward to hearing from you and having the opportunity to interact with you a little bit at the conclusion of your remarks. So Chairman Pai, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, members of the committee. Thank you for holding this hearing. I appreciate this opportunity to update you on the work of the FCC. But before doing so, I would like to thank this committee for the assistance that it has given our agency. Earlier this year, as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act, Congress passed the Mobile Now Act, which originated in this committee. Mobile Now requires the FCC to move forward with freeing up 255 megahertz of federal and non-federal spectrum for mobile and fixed wireless broadband, including spectrum for unlicensed use. This new spectrum will be critical for the rollout of 5G services, the next generation of wireless connectivity. The FCC is taking your lead when it comes to 5G. This year, we are starting the 28 gigahertz band auction, followed immediately by an auction of the 24 gigahertz band. In the second half of 2019, we intend to hold an auction of spectrum in the 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands. Combined, these auctions will make almost 5 gigahertz of spectrum available and advance America's global leadership in 5G. And none of this would have been possible without this committee's leadership. The FCC is also hard at work addressing our top priority, closing the digital divide. We are doing this in two basic ways: reforming our subsidy programs and modernizing our regulations. With respect to the first, last month we kicked off our Connect America Fund Phase 2 reverse auction, which will provide up to $2 billion over the next decade to bring fixed broadband to unserved parts of rural America. Earlier this year, we dedicated $500 million in additional funding to assist small carriers deploying rural broadband. And we boosted telemedicine's promise by increasing funding in our rural healthcare program by $171 million a year, a 43% increase, as well as adjusting the cap going forward to account for inflation. With respect to modernizing our rules, we are cutting through the regulatory red tape and making it easier for broadband providers to invest in next-generation networks. We have exempted small cells from the federal historic preservation and environmental review processes that were designed for traditional large towers. We've updated our business data services regulations. We have reformed our network transition rules to make it easier for companies to upgrade from the fading networks of the past to the resilient networks of tomorrow. We're making it easier and cheaper for providers, especially competitive entrants, to get access to utility poles with one-touch make-ready rules. And we have returned to the successful light-touch regulatory framework under which the Internet flourished in the United States from 1996 until 2015. Overall, our policies to promote broadband deployment and close the digital divide are working. According to a recent study, in 2017, more commercial buildings in the United States added fiber connections than in any year since at least 2004. Another recent report showed that broadband network investment in the United States increased by $1.5 billion to $3 billion in 2017 alone, reversing the declines that occurred during the last 2 years of the prior administration. This increased investment is having a tangible and positive impact on American consumers. To give you just one example, VTEL is a small internet service provider based in Springfield, Vermont. The company reported recently that it, quote, committed $4 million to purchase equipment and services to upgrade its LTE core to enable voice roaming and Wi-Fi calling to all our Vermont rural subscribers, and to simultaneously begin rolling out faster mobile broadband that will start our transition to 5G, unquote. VTEL concluded, and I quote again, "We are quite optimistic about the future, and the current FCC is a significant reason for our optimism." In short, we are on the right track. Finally, I would like to address a story that has received a lot of attention over the past 24 hours. Last Friday, the United States government sued in a Texas federal district court to enforce a $15,000 forfeiture order issued by the FCC's Enforcement Bureau in 2014 against a pirate radio station in Austin, Texas. Normally, our pirate radio enforcement efforts don't make national news, but this one has, because the pirate radio station in question was airing Alex Jones's show. Some have criticized the FCC for removing Mr. Jones from the airwaves in Austin, allegedly because of the content of his program. Many others have praised us for allegedly taking that same action. It is important to make clear that our pirate radio enforcement efforts, including this one, have nothing to do with the content that pirate radio stations air. We act against pirate radio stations because they are violating the law by broadcasting on the FM airwaves without a license. Indeed, in this case, the operators of the FM stations received a warning from the FCC that they were broadcasting without a license, yet refused to come into compliance with the law. We will always follow the law. Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, members of the committee, thank you once again for holding this hearing. I look forward to working with you and your staffs in the time to come on these important issues.
Thank you, Chairman Pai. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by extending my thanks to Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and the members of the committee for the honor to engage with you about the decisions and workings of the Federal Communications Commission. Today, I'd like to highlight a few critical issues that have been a focus of mine. First, I firmly believe that the ongoing problem with 911 fee diversion by certain states and territories must end once and for all. Such diversion, beyond deceiving the ratepayers, has real consequences for the public safety community and the American people in need of critical emergency assistance at some of the darkest moments of their lives. Well, the work Commissioner Rosenworcel and I have led has resulted in several states and territories clarifying their reported diversion or making commitments to prevent a reoccurrence. Not every state or territory has been a success story. Accordingly, I suggest additional action such as federal legislation will be necessary to address recalcitrant states. I understand that this committee may be looking at crafting such a bill, and I would be pleased to help in any way possible. Second, the Commission is focused on taking every step necessary to provide all Americans the opportunity to access broadband services. At the same time, the Commission's efforts should be examined in parallel with programs by other federal agencies. While efforts to provide other agencies, such as the Rural Utilities Service at the Department of Agriculture, with new federal money are commendable, there is a potential for certain problems to arise. Fundamentally, I believe that federal funding should be targeted to those 14 million plus Americans without broadband today. As Congress concludes the Farm Bill this fall, I hope you will consider additional safeguards, including strict prohibitions on duplication with other existing programs, alignment of speed requirements, and a focus on the truly unserved. Third, I previously brought to this committee's attention my concerns regarding the inner workings of the ITU. Based on my firsthand experiences and many conversations with experts very engaged in ITU issues, the organization faces real problems ranging from mission creep and bureaucratic overreach to basic inefficiencies and blatant cronyism. I believe the ITU can be beneficial for U.S. interests, and I think it can serve an important function. But as I outlined in my written testimony, change is needed to ensure it remains a viable institution. In the end, the United States must pursue the best course of action to meet its own spectrum needs. It is up to the global community to either increase the likelihood of ITU success or risk further fragmentation and, like nations, pursuing spectrum policy elsewhere. Lastly, turning to spectrum policy, the Commission has been hard at work ensuring that sufficient spectrum is available for the next generation wireless services. I recognized years ago that there was a need for a solid mid-band play for wireless carriers to offer 5G services both domestically and internationally. The 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, or the C-band downlink, is an attractive option for this purpose, as it provides sufficient contiguous spectrum, and the largest satellite operators are receptive to reducing their spectrum footprints using a market-based spectrum reallocation approach. Additionally, I have previously proposed several ideas to improve the efficiency of government spectrum users. Well, I hope they be given appropriate consideration. Both Commissioner Rosenworcel and I have proposed at minimum putting a market value on current federal spectrum holdings to ensure they are appropriately quantified. If implemented, it would allow policymakers to consider an additional factor when reviewing the spectrum holdings of the federal government. Finally, I want to commend the committee for introduction of legislative efforts related to communications policy that, if enacted, would be incredibly helpful. These include Chairman Thune and Senator Schatz' Streamline Act, Senator Gardner's and Hassan's, Airwaves Act, and Senators Wicker and Schatz's Spectrum Now Act. I thank the committee for holding this hearing, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the chance to testify. At the outset, I want to commend the committee on its own notable and bipartisan achievements, from Mobile Now and the Airwaves Act, which identifies spectrum needed to win the race to 5G, to the SPEED Act, Rapid Act, and the Streamlined Small Cell Deployment Act, which would cut red tape that threatens the deployment of next-gen networks. Those two issues, spectrum and infrastructure, are key to the deployment of 5G. I'm confident that action on these fronts will make a difference in bringing more broadband to more Americans. I've seen firsthand the challenges of deploying networks in some of the hardest to serve parts of the country. I've spent time in many of your home states and heard from families and small businesses about the opportunities that connectivity enables. Chancellor, South Dakota exemplifies those challenges and opportunities. It's where I met Tyler, a scrappy entrepreneur that ran a tech startup from his home. Tyler needed a better broadband connection, so he created one himself. He asked an ISP to run fiber to an old wooden utility pole near his house. He then set up a fixed wireless link to bridge the gap to his home. Finding success for himself, Tyler decided to launch his own ISP and bring wireless broadband to his community. 180 feet up a nearby water tower, he showed me the antenna he uses to serve his customers, including Dwayne, who runs a farm 9 miles away. When we met Dwayne, he immediately volunteered that he used to go to church regularly. And in the moment, I thought it was an unnecessary confession to an FCC bureaucrat. Turns out that without broadband, Dwayne would use the church's Wi-Fi almost daily to get his work done. Now, with broadband at home, Dwayne is quick to point out that he still goes to church, but he can now focus on a higher purpose. Meeting Tyler and Dwayne only underscores why the work of this committee and the FCC is so important. We want every community to get a fair shot at the opportunity broadband enables. To do that, we must keep moving forward on those two key issues, spectrum and infrastructure. And we're making substantial progress on both. I want to focus this morning on infrastructure. I appreciate that Chairman Pai asked me to lead the FCC's efforts on wireless infrastructure. And we're getting our regulations 5G ready. In March, we exempted small cells, which are the building blocks of next-gen networks, from the costly federal review procedures designed for much larger 100-foot towers. This one step is expected to cut about 30% of the cost of deploying small cells, which can flip the business case for thousands of communities. One place where this additional deployment can pay off is in healthcare. The FCC has long supported broadband deployment to healthcare facilities, but on a visit to Mississippi 6 months ago, Senator Wicker told me about a local project that demonstrated a new trend in telehealth, a trend towards connected care everywhere. The delivery of high-quality care is no longer limited to the confines of connected brick-and-mortar facilities. With remote patient monitoring and mobile health apps, technology can now deliver care directly to patients. Last month, I returned to Mississippi and visited the Delta, which is ground zero for the country's diabetes epidemic. It's where I met Miss Annie. She noticed the first signs of diabetes when she woke up with blurred vision. So she signed up for a remote patient monitoring program. She showed me the iPad and the Bluetooth-enabled blood sugar monitor that she uses to test her blood from home, and it gives her instant feedback, including steps she can take that day to stay healthy. Miss Annie's A1C levels have gone down, and she says she's never felt better. And research backs up Miss Annie's results, showing significant cost savings and improved patient outcomes with connected care. So we should align public policy in support of this movement in telehealth. Many members of this committee have led the way on these efforts, recognizing that there's more the FCC can do. That's why I'm glad Chairman Pai asked me to lead the FCC's new telehealth initiative. And just 2 weeks ago, the Commission voted unanimously to seek comment on setting up a new $100 million connected care pilot program, which would support these types of deployments for low-income patients. I look forward to working with all stakeholders as we move forward in that proceeding. So Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, members of the committee, thank you again for holding this hearing. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Good morning, Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I believe the future belongs to the connected. No matter who you are or where you live in this country, you need access to modern communications to have a fair shot at 21st century success. Clearing the way for this connected future should be at the heart of everything we do at the Federal Communications Commission. Last week marked a year since I returned to the Commission, and a lot can happen in 12 months, so let me offer you a quick year-end report. Too many Americans lack access to broadband. Let's put a number on it. Right now, 24 million Americans have no access to high-speed service. This is not acceptable, and we need to do better. Too often during the last year, the agency acted at the behest of the corporate forces that surround it, shortchanging the American people. You can see it clearly with our rollback of net neutrality. You see it too with our efforts to foster the deployment of new networks, but failure to fully engage those who need to be with a voice in our policies, the cities and towns that should be our partner in the process, the tribal communities that are entitled to government consultation, and the Department of Commerce, which just last month expressed concern about how our rush to reform could harm national security and public safety services. Likewise, you see it in proposed reforms that undermine our Lifeline program, including the 2 million elderly, more than 1 million veterans, and more than 500,000 residents of Puerto Rico who rely on it today. Too often, our procedures fall short of what good governance requires. Our mapping practices for broadband do not accurately state what connectivity looks like on the ground. Our claim that the agency suffered a DDoS attack following John Oliver's report on net neutrality is just not credible. And in the meantime, this agency has ignored the fact that this public docket is flooded with fraud, including 500,000 comments from Russia and 2 million individuals with stolen identities. I believe these things need to be fixed. I also believe at this table, there is a desire to extend the reach of broadband service, lead the world in 5G wireless deployment, and bring the opportunities of the digital age to more people in more places. So here are 3 quick things we can do to make that happen. First, we need a new broadband plan, and we need to begin with the end in mind. At the start, I mentioned there are 24 million Americans without access to broadband right now. There are 19 million Americans who do not have access to high-speed service in rural America. And there are 12 million students who fall into the homework gap because they do not have the broadband at home they need for nightly schoolwork. Let's commit now to a plan to ensure that every one of them has access to the high-speed service they need by 2020. Second, we're in a worldwide race to lead the future of wireless. We're making progress, but other nations are moving further and faster. South Korea, the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, Germany, Ireland, and Australia have held or will hold 5G auctions before we do. China also is poised to dole out key frequencies it's already reserved for 5G wireless service. Right now, we have a blitz of 12.5 bands under consideration, but we only have 1 big auction scheduled. What we need now is actually something quite simple. We need a spectrum calendar. We need to tell the wireless ecosystem, from carriers to equipment manufacturers to consumers, just how and when the FCC will auction new airwaves to support 5G wireless services. Third, it's time to set some audacious goals. Let's not settle for the same broadband standard we've used for years. Let's decide to raise it to 100 megabits. Let's make sure every school has gigabit speeds in their sites. And let's ensure every rural healthcare facility has the speed they need for the newest innovations in telemedicine. And while we're at it, let's do something that should not be bold, but might feel like it is. Let's reiterate the FCC's support for the First Amendment and commit to media policies that ensure news organizations can report without fear or favor. Thank you for having me at this hearing. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel. Let me start off. Chairman Pai, the Universal Service Fund's high-cost program is a crucial component to broadband deployment in rural areas. And I cannot stress enough the importance of providing certainty to internet service providers as they plan for deployment in rural areas. For instance, in my home state of South Dakota, these projects are scheduled well in advance, and builds are often planned around warmer seasons. A decision that provides certainty for years to come will go a long way in helping the deployment of broadband in rural areas. Mr. Chairman, are you willing to commit here today that the Commission will come to a decision that will provide certainty to rural America by the end of the year?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I am.
Thank you. Look forward to working with you and your fellow commissioners on that goal. Commissioner Carr, a number of states have adopted bills to streamline the deployment of small wireless facilities, and some localities have negotiated private arrangements with providers to facilitate deployment. But these steps are not uniform, and they're not happening everywhere, as the business case for deployment of 5G is often more challenging in rural areas due to lower population density. Could you discuss why it is important to set a national framework?
Thank you, Senator. I think you're right. I'm glad to see a number of states that have taken action to modernize their regulations. But winning the race to 5G, in my mind, is making sure that every community gets a fair shot. Places like New York, San Francisco, they're going to get next-generation opportunity no matter what. But we've heard from elected representatives from South Carolina to Montana that want 5G in their communities as well, and they've talked about the problems that they see with high fees in certain areas, diverting capital and resources, and therefore not giving them a fair shot at next-gen opportunities. That's why I think some of the ideas about guardrails in this process are so important.
There's a recent analysis of spectrum at 1.3 gigahertz paired with spectrum at 1.8 gigahertz that's shown that this spectrum might be a particularly valuable part of the mix of low, mid, and high-band spectrum used for 5G. In addition, it could reportedly bring more than $50 billion in revenues for the American people, and multiples of that for its contribution to the economy. Also, given its propagation characteristics, this spectrum might be more suitable for less populated areas. What has the Commission done to assess this spectrum for next-generation telecommunications? And I would direct that to whoever, Mr. Chairman, if you want to answer that, or whomever.
Sure, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. As with a number of different spectrum bands, we and the FCC's career staff are focusing on any band that could be usable for 5G, including that one. And so we hope to make progress in the future on it. In the meantime, our efforts proceed apace on all kinds of other fronts, from 6 gigahertz to 3.5 gigahertz, from the C band to the 24 gigahertz band. We're active. We're not waiting to finish our analysis of one band before moving to the other. We're holistic in our approach.
Commissioner O'Reilly, rural communities need better access to broadband. We have sources such as the Universal Service Fund, as well as others like USDA's Rural Utilities Service Broadband Loan and Grant programs. They can all play important roles in advancing the build-out of rural broadband. How do we make sure, and I think you alluded to this in your testimony, that these programs are working in coordination to avoid overbuilding areas that are already receiving support?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's a lot of really good work that went into the Senate Farm Bill, so I don't want to be too critical of it. I think there are some places where it can be strengthened to prevent overbuilding, to prevent those networks that are already existing in places like South Dakota that I visited, do not have a government-sponsored competitor come in and take away the heart of the company that's trying to serve that area. Because it's easy to serve the industrial park or the anchor institution. It's harder to serve the surrounding areas, and hollowing out the provider's base of operations is incredibly problematic. So I think there are some provisions in the Farm Bill that I appreciate. I think that they could go a little further, and I'm happy to work with the committee to make sure that happens.
Could you explain why overbuilding would be a concern, and what suggestions would you have? I mean, follow up on your.
Well, I give you the point that the Farm Bill reduces from 3 to 2 the number of providers that are, so you have 2 providers, but it's still considered unserved. But in many parts of America, they have 0. And I've talked to those families who have no provider today, and that should be whether it's 14 million or 24 million, depending on whether you count satellite. I tend to count those that have satellite. So 14 million Americans do not have service today, and we're trying to figure out how to get them service. If you're trying to compare that to already having 2 providers and contemplating a 3rd federal subsidy coming in for the 3rd provider, that's a much different universe, and I think we should focus on those that are truly unserved.
And so in terms of avoiding or minimizing overbuilding, you think it's just a function of how some of those programs are administered?
I think it's more than just administration. I think it's the language in the bill, because as good as agencies are in working together, we've seen in the past and have had problems with other federal subsidy programs where as much as conversations that went on, they didn't solve the problems, and we saw overbuilding notwithstanding. So I think it really matters what the language is in terms of the programs themselves.
Okay. My time has expired. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Chairman Pai, for the commitment to the chairman of getting broadband done for the underserved areas. The issue of Puerto Rico, you well know what's happened to our fellow U.S. citizens there on communication. Chairman, is the FCC working with FEMA to revise both agencies' disaster response plan to include communications restoration?
Thank you for the question, Senator. My understanding is that our Public Safety Bureau staff is indeed working with FEMA on that issue. I can double check to make sure that is still the case, but across the board, we've been cooperating with FEMA and our other federal and state and territorial partners on this issue.
When American citizens are hurting after a national disaster, they need communications. It would be well if you could get your folks cooperating with FEMA. Commissioner Rosenworcel, do you believe the FCC has done what it needs to do to learn from what happened in last year's hurricanes?
Thank you for the question, Senator. We obviously had an awful storm and a grave humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico last year. And I would take note that the FCC in the past, after Hurricane Katrina and after Superstorm Sandy, did things like held hearings on site to try to learn what was going on, under the belief that we don't just figure it all out sitting here in Washington, and actually produced a report with lessons learned. We still have not done that with Hurricane Maria or any of the hurricanes from last year, and I think it's incumbent upon us to do that. We should understand what went wrong, what went right, and how we can prevent it from happening again.
Commissioner, you know all the falderall that's gone on about the actions the agency has adopted to pave the way for broadcast consolidation, even beyond, look beyond Sinclair Tribune. Do you think that, what actions have the agency taken?
Broadcasting, Senator, is special. It uses the public airwaves. And for decades, this agency has had policies to support competition, diversity, and localism. They may not be especially trendy, but I think those values, they're solid. They've supported journalism and jobs, and they have made sure that there's a diversity of voices in every community. But we have rolled back our rules to the point where we almost have none. We no longer have limitations on the numbers of top television stations you can own in a market, the number of stations you can own in markets and nationwide as well. And the result of that is we're going to start seeing fewer and fewer local voices on the airwaves, and I think that has consequences for jobs, for journalisms, and getting the facts we need in our communities.
There seems to be a value to local broadcasting. Is this beginning to remove local from the term local broadcasting?
Yes, Senator, I'm worried that we are losing localism in broadcasting. It's something that has a terrific tradition. It's something I think we should, through our policies, seek to continue.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Senator Wicker.
Thank you, members of the commission. Commissioner Pai, let me give you an opportunity to answer some of the statements that your colleague, Ms. Rosenworcel, made. Talk about the what she said about the undermining the Lifeline program. What do you have to say to that?
Thank you for the question, Senator Wicker. It is absolutely false. Our goal is to make sure that the Lifeline program, once and for all, focuses on consumers, not on the unscrupulous companies that for too long have bilked the FCC, have bilked the American taxpayer of their hard-earned dollars. Our goal is to make sure that every American who needs help through the Lifeline program is able to get it. And that is precisely the reason why we are trying to target these funds on some of the folks who are vulnerable. By definition, every dollar that is siphoned off by an unscrupulous wireless provider, for example, cannot go to somebody who needs the help. And that's why we've taken aggressive action on the enforcement side to make sure that we weed out some of those unscrupulous actors. That's why we're looking at reforms currently in our pending proceeding to make sure that every dollar that is spent, so the Senate, this body, Congress generally, can have confidence it's being spent to close the digital divide.
An interesting other side of that argument. What about the allegation that the Commerce Department expressed concern about the rush to reform and a harm to national security and public safety?
First, in context, it's a remarkable example of plucking one little provision out of an otherwise very, very supportive statement. Nonetheless, we are working with our federal partners at NTIA to make sure that we progress based on the facts in the record. Moreover, I would argue, look at what the biggest argument thus far has been in all the comments: closing the digital divide and incentivizing more infrastructure investment. Every single dollar that is diverted to maintaining the fading copper networks that are in the ground now cannot go toward laying fiber, toward building 5G infrastructure, toward closing the digital divide with next-generation technologies. And so all of the hue and cry about the copper retirement and network transition rules and et cetera have to keep that overall focus in mind. Our goal is to close the digital divide, to make sure that folks in Mississippi and Montana and everywhere else have the same infrastructure that people in the big cities can take advantage of.
The statement by the Department of Commerce was largely supportive.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, how are we doing with the tribal governments?
There too, to my understanding at least, I've engaged in more face-to-face consultations with tribes than a number of my predecessors combined. I've personally been on the ground in Mission, South Dakota, to the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. I've personally been to the Navajo Nation Reservation in Arizona. I've personally visited with the NCAI College in Connecticut last year. And we've done outreach to, I believe, several dozen tribes in the FCC's headquarters that I personally attended for over 3 hours. It is important for us to close the digital divide, and that nowhere is that digital divide greater than on tribal lands. I was recently in the Flathead Reservation, as I told Senator Tester. When you see what is going on in St. Ignatius, how a lot of folks are worried about their future because they don't have broadband, and they think, well, we need to move to Great Falls or Billings or even a bigger city to be able to get that technology, that is something that we need to address. That is exactly the reason why we focused on tribal broadband, on providing more operational expenses for tribal carriers, for incentivizing it through the tribal broadband factor and our rate of return reforms.
See if I can squeeze two more in.
Sorry.
On the net neutrality,
yeah.
You've got a choice when you're going to regulate the internet, and that's the light touch approach that has really brought about the success of the internet for all except 2 years of its existence. And then you have the idea that we should use a 1934 Act designed to be applicable during the Depression era to the Ma Bells. I suppose since the new order by the FCC, I assume we've had a spate of throttling and blocking that's just been outrageous. Has that been the case since the FCC entered its new order?
That has not been the case, Senator. We were told for many months that this decision would be, quote, the end of the internet as we know it, that if this decision passed, you would get the internet one word at a time. That has proved flatly false. It has been 67 days since the repeal. The internet is still working. It's open and free. The FCC is working with FTC to protect consumers. And based on the example of VTEL that I suggested, there are many others that show that our decision is having a positive impact.
You know, you were having to rush through your statement, but I do believe that the Washington Post gave that allegation 3 Pinocchios. So your full report, your full statement will be in the record. One thing I do want to agree with is the maps are a real problem.
Can I address that, Senator?
Well, absolutely.
So I'm very pleased to announce that the FCC has adopted an order that would extend by 90 days the period within which carriers, farm bureaus, Senator Joe Manchin, to whom we granted a waiver, everybody can file a challenge to those maps. We want to make sure we give everybody a full and fair opportunity to participate in the challenge process to make sure we're operating on the basis of accurate data.
And I think you've granted a waiver to the Mississippi Farm Bureau.
That is correct.
They want to challenge it. Actually, I'm asking Mississippi State University's Innovative Center to explore using drones and see if we can get better information with the use of some different sort of challenge. I don't know that we're going to get an accurate map, even with the challenge process. But I do think there is widespread concern across the political spectrum that we're going to end up with a map that doesn't fairly distribute this $4.5 billion to people who need coverage. So work with us on that. I'm still skeptical. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Pai, a lot of discussion about spectrum and forward viewing, how the value of the spectrum and how we use it, and I think the committee is supportive of that as the Commission appears to be using that spectrum in the best possible way. There are always transition concerns in spectrum. I know people already who occupy, for instance, the C-band, which we're talking about making a transition there. I know you have an ongoing proceeding on that. As you continue to work on this proceeding, could you explain to me the plans you have to be sure that current users of the band are protected from, first of all, interference, and secondly, undue harm?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The C-band is an important band. It's 500 megahertz of spectrum from 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz. And as I outlined recently in a letter in response to Senator Tester, we are taking an approach to make sure that we give everybody a fair shake. For example, we are granting waivers to make sure that the expensive engineering studies that are typically required for these applications don't have to be filed. We are extending the time within which those entities have to file, and we're taking other steps to make it easier for them to be able to participate. Our goal is to essentially balance two competing interests. Number one, to figure out what the best valued use of the spectrum is, and on the other hand, to make sure that we know where existing users of that spectrum might be. And with respect to that second piece, we want to make sure that broadcasters, anybody, that they make their voices heard at the FCC, because we can't protect them if we don't know they're there. And so we're easing that process. Congress, of course, has mandated an application fee. That's something we don't have the discretion to waive. But beyond that, we are taking steps to make sure that we make it a smooth transition, whatever decision the FCC ends up making.
Well, I believe it's the view of the committee and hopefully the view of the FCC that the people who've made an investment there, have made a commitment there, are not harmed by this effort to use the spectrum to our best possible advantage for broadband and other items. So let me go to broadband next. We have, for instance, Missouri, we have several companies that are rate of return carriers. They have access to the possibility of the alternative Connect America model, but I'm not at all sure and have real questions as to whether the amount of money provided in that model is now enough to do what needs to be done for the people that are hard to serve. Do you have a comment on that?
I do. So last month, the FCC extended, I believe it's $36 million additional dollars to make sure that we close some of the gap that some of those carriers were perceiving. Additionally, I've just committed, including here, to work with my fellow commissioners, with the committee, to make sure that we update our system to provide predictable, sufficient support. That's not just an aspiration, that is the law that Congress saw fit to instruct the FCC with. So we're going to make sure that we give carriers the certainty they need to be able to deploy in places like West Plains and Ozark, two small towns that I personally visited, where I saw the challenges of deploying broadband in rural areas.
Well, we have about 50% of our rural population does not have access. Now, I think the national average is now 31%. It's troubling to me that we've gotten behind on that. We have 3% of the rural population of the whole country, and half of them don't have access. So let's go down the row of the other commissioners here. Your ideas of better ways to use the Universal Service Fund or spectrum sales, or how do we close this gap that all of you, I think, in one way or another have talked about, from the agriculture now very dependent on broadband access, schools and homework, that homework deficit. If you live close to school, you may have an opportunity to have a lot more access during homework. But let's just go down with your thoughts on this, starting with you, Commissioner Riley.
Sure. So I think the chairman has done a great job in moving forward a number of our universal service funding programs. We have one going on right now, Connect America Fund, CAF. The Phase 2 auction for reverse auction is running right now, so hopefully that will buy down areas that don't have service today. We're going to have to deal with the harder areas, those that don't have service and will not likely be covered by this. These are the hardest to hard serve areas, and I've been pushing for that to deal with what's known as Remote Areas Fund, and we've got some heavy work to do to deal with that. The real part is trying to coordinate that the holes that we have with the other money that Congress has allocated to make sure that the $600 million for the pilot program in last year's appropriation bill and the 1.2 or more that we may see as part of the Farm Bill, that actually goes to try and address those people who don't have service today. So trying to make sure that they coordinate. And then on spectrum, your point's well taken. We're trying to find the right mixture of licensees and licenses, so we address the fact that there are needs for both big providers and small providers, and try and find that middle ground that addresses everyone's concerns. So we're working hard on this. It is everyone. I think Commissioner Rosenworcel said it well, and I've said it before. We're all committed to this goal of addressing those that don't have service.
Mr. Carr?
I would agree. I think there's three principal issues. One, we need to continue to open up and allocate more spectrum, which we're working to do, and a lot of the legislative bills being considered would also do. Second, we need to continue to update our infrastructure rules so they account for changes in technology and that they're encouraging deployment and not holding it back. And I think three, we're continuing to reorient our universal service funding, both with the $2 billion CAF 2 auction ongoing and the $4 billion MF2. If I got a fourth, Chairman Pai had identified a rural dividend that I believe is included in some legislative ideas, which would take some of the private sector money that's raised through auction and find ways to help support build out in rural areas.
And Ms. Rosenworcel.
All right, I've got three, too. First, we need better maps. Our maps right now don't reflect what it really looks like on the ground. We should stop thinking we can do this alone in Washington. We have to go out to the American public and private sector actors and get their assistance and help before we distribute billions of dollars. Second, when we do have spectrum auctions, we need to have some smaller licenses, so some smaller companies that want to serve rural communities have a fair shot of bidding for them in the process and providing service. And third, when we do issue those licenses, it's important that when we develop build-out criteria, we make the build-out criteria on the basis of geography, reaching, for instance, 80% of the geography and not just 80% of the population, which is a standard that would be biased towards urban areas.
Thank you, Senator Blunt. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, commissioners, for being here. Commissioner Pai, where are we with contribution reform?
I would defer that question, Senator, to Chairman O'Reilly. He's the chairman of our joint board on contributions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. We're at a crossroads on contribution reform. There are many different ideas, and there is a state proposal that has been put forward that I don't think is viable amongst the members, and we haven't been able to cross that that approach, but haven't been able to find something commonality on that. So we're stuck at the moment, to be quite honest, and it's been something we've been stuck at for quite a while. It's something I inherited. It's something that's been going on, and nobody has a perfect answer. And you see this fight in different states as they're trying to figure out different. There's been at least a half dozen states that are trying to figure out what is the new formula, what should it look like, what should it include, and there has been no agreement.
I understand the difficulty, and you understand the urgency.
Yeah.
So we'll follow up with each of the commissioners. This is an essential part of policy here. I know it's the hard part, but we still have to do it. Chairman Pai, I want to follow up on the DDoS attack. What strikes me as difficult to digest is that there was an unprecedented number of comments that came in after the first John Oliver show that overwhelmed the system, and then there was another batch of unprecedented communications to the FCC website, and everybody figured that it was the same as last time, just intuitively. and then your CIO said that it was a DDoS attack, and yet, you know, Ron Wyden and I and others in the legislative branch said that doesn't make any sense. The tech community said that doesn't make any sense. I think a lot of people's first instinct was that it didn't make any sense. So I understand your reliance on your CIO. I don't blame you for that. My question is, did you have any doubt at any time before the report came out a couple of weeks ago?
Senator, on May 8th, I believe it was, that Monday, when I heard that the ECFS system had been overwhelmed for a couple of hours, as I then understood it, my assumption was that it was John Oliver's viewers. Or,
right, so I got that part.
Yeah.
Then the CIO tells you it's a DDoS attack.
Correct.
And then you basically declare to the world that it was a DDoS attack,
Right.
and including communicating with Congress that a federal crime has been committed. And the thing that I wonder about is, given your expertise in the law and expertise in tech, that why didn't you entertain any of those quite reasonable doubts that were out there in the community, or out there among your former colleagues in the tech community? It just seems odd that the moment your CIO says something, that you run with it, and you ran with it quite aggressively all the way up until the point where, I guess it was last week or the week before, you say, well, I was duped. That's very hard to digest. So I'm trying to figure out, did you ever have any doubt between the point at which your CIO told you something and the point at which the IG told you that it was wrong?
Senator, I would urge any critics on this issue, read the entire report.
Right, I read
you will
the
see,
report.
if I could just answer, Senator.
But no, you're not answering my question.
I-
Did you have any doubt?
Senator, I did have doubts, which is why I asked our Chief of Staff, who then asked the CIO explicitly, is this a result of John Oliver's viewers? He said, and I quote, "We are 99% confident this was external folks deliberately trying to tie up the server." And he continued, "This was definitely high traffic targeting ECFS to make it appear unresponsive to others."
So you
Later
have-
on July 24th, I had a meeting in my office with certain IT staff. We asked them again, are you confident that this is what happened? They said yes, essentially replicating what the former CIO said in his
And
statement.
do you have, okay, I get it. So now you're trying to sort of muddle through this as your CIO is telling you something and the rest of the world is saying, that doesn't seem right. The question I have is, in terms of your relationship with this committee and the public, and in the context of a quite partisan, quite hot battle around net neutrality and the legitimacy of the participation of the public in this net neutrality process, did it ever occur to you to say, you know, I've got these doubts now, and so my declarative statements from before, I'm not so sure that I should stick with those, and I'd like to modify my statements. In fact, Senator Schatz and Senator Wyden, I'd like to answer the letter that you sent me. So at some point before the IG report came out, did it occur to you to communicate back with the public that this may not have been a DDoS attack?
Senator, on January 23rd of 2018, I was informed by my Chief of Staff, who had been informed by the Office of Inspector General, that they had suspicions that the former Chief Information Officer's statements to us and to Congress were inaccurate. The OIG then requested, because they had referred this matter for potential criminal prosecution to the Department of Justice, do not say anything to anyone. Ultimately, the OIG, it became known they were developing a report and that they were going to issue this report. Once we knew what conclusions were, it was very hard to stay quiet. We wanted the story to get out, not only because it vindicated what we'd been saying, that we'd relied on the Chief Information Officer's representations, but also because otherwise we knew that members of this committee, including potentially you, would think, well, he knew something was wrong, but he didn't tell us about it. So the position I was in was, do we breach the Office of Inspector General's request for confidentiality, in which case the accusation from perhaps members of this committee would be, he's jeopardizing an independent OIG investigation, including a potential criminal prosecution, or do I adhere to the independent Inspector General's request?
I know.
It's a difficult position to be in. I made the judgment that we had to adhere to the OIG's request, even though I knew we would be falsely attacked for having done something
Do
inappropriate.
you
here.
consider my line of inquiry a false attack?
No, I'm saying plenty of others have certainly not held loose about these
I
accusations.
guess what I'm looking for is some measure of accountability as the chairman.
Oh.
And I understand that you were in a difficult position, but I can't imagine that there was not another way to thread this needle and deal with us in our oversight capacity.
Senator, I guess my only request to you would be, put yourself in my position from January 23rd until August 3rd or whatever it was, the report came out. You have a request from an Inspector General, do not say anything to anyone. The story in this report vindicates my position. It was in our interest to get it out sooner. We wanted you to get this information sooner because it proved what we said. We didn't have the ability to do that. I could have done it, but then I would have been accused of stifling an OAG investigation, potentially frustrating a criminal prosecution. I did what I thought was the right thing to do, which was to stick by the OIG recommendation. And as I pointed out in my August 10th letter, and I quoted the very text on which we relied from May 9th, I believe it was, all the way forward. We relied on the representations of the former chief information officer, which in the OIG's investigation, and I would urge you in particular to read the memorandum of interview if you haven't. Those vindicate the position. We asked them, is this what it is? They said no. Have you talked to the FBI and DHS? They said yes. Those agencies have essentially concurred in our recommendations. That was not true.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. With such short time and so many questions, I am reluctant to ask all of you to respond, so I would defer to you to respond who feels compelled to provide me an answer to my questions. I want to start with the USF High Cost Program. We worked with the Senate Appropriations Committee to include in FSGG language that would encourage the FCC to conduct a comprehensive assessment of what is needed, quote, what is needed to appropriately fund the high cost program to fulfill its statutory mandate for universal service. I support the short-term funding the FCC agreed to provide rate of return carriers to mitigate the immediate effects of the budget control mechanism. My question is, what is the current state of the assessment of this program, and what is the status of the short-term funds? We've had this conversation many times, but USF high cost is not receiving the dollars that it needs.
You left it open to everybody, so I'll pass that on to my colleagues. But no, Senator, I'll take the question. We do have an open proceeding. It was important to me because I heard your concerns and the concerns of carriers throughout Kansas that the budget control mechanism in particular was creating a lot of uncertainty. So as you know, we suspended that temporarily, issued an NPRM in March, and as I've committed here, we are going to work with our colleagues here and at the committee to make sure by the end of the year we have a rate of return system that provides that predictability and sufficient support that you require.
The chairman mentioned this in his comments, and I would join him in stressing to you the importance of this issue. Let me talk to maybe to Commissioner O'Reilly, who has been most vocal on this. We provided in the Farm Bill those barriers, those opportunities to narrow the scope of subsidizing places that already have a carrier, already have a service. What kind of interagency communications are already taking place between USDA, the FCC, and NTIA about bridging the digital divide?
I think the best answer by the chairman, who's had teams working on this. I'm not party to them.
We may spend more time deciding who's going to answer the question than I'm saying.
Senator, with respect to USDA, we have been actively collaborating. For example, I've spoken repeatedly with Secretary Perdue as well as the administrator of RUS, who's from Missouri, to figure out ways to make sure we're on the same page with respect to the $600 million that they're now distributing. We're also working together to make sure that our USF programs generally cohere, working with NTIA on a whole variety of issues to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to broadband deployment.
I'm not sure what Commissioner Rosenworcel was specifically addressing in her comments, but it caught my attention. Most recently, the CEO of Nextech Wireless in my hometown of Hayes, Kansas, expressed support for extending the challenge process on the Mobility Fund Phase 2 auction based upon difficulties carriers and others are experiencing in collecting reliable data, urging the FCC to, quote, measure twice and cut once, before dispersing over $4 billion of resources. I've expressed a lot of concern about the initial eligibility map. I think it dramatically overstates existing unsubsidized coverage in my state, and looking at the map, my belief is it's elsewhere as well. You, Chairman Pai, met with me, and I appreciate that conversation along with Chairman Wicker and others. And one of my complaints then and now is that the FCC has put in place a map that is known to be flawed and expects others to fix the problem. That, to me, as I indicated previously, is not the way that government should work. My question is, what efforts beyond the challenge process is the FCC able, willing, or now doing to see that the map is righted before we cut twice and whatever that expression was, before that happened?
Thanks for the question, Senator. We inherited from the prior FCC a mess when it came to the map. We essentially asked every single carrier to report based on its own preferred technical parameters where they had coverage. Well, that wasn't good enough for me, and so I urged, and the FCC approved, bespoke data collection to make sure that we got based on the same technical parameters for every single carrier, show us where you have coverage. And then we overlaid all of those. And then on top of that, we said, now we're going to open it up for a challenge process, as you know. I'm pleased to report, as I mentioned to Senator Wicker, that we have adopted an order that extends by 90 days until November 28th, the time frame within which to promulgate a challenge. We also have extended waivers to the Kansas Farm Bureau, the Mississippi Farm Bureau, to elected officials like Senator Manchin, and to others to participate in that challenge process. Our Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force has put out a map showing just areas where there's one unsubsidized competitor to make it easier to target the areas that are ripe for challenge. We've also made it easier to we've essentially changed the buffer area to make it much easier to submit a challenge. So a variety of steps that we have taken have made it much easier than it was in January of 2017 when I came on board. But I agree with you. We should not be distributing this funding to parts of the country that are unserved if we don't know they're unserved. And that's what the entire goal of our new data collection is.
I think the answer that I hear you saying, Chairman, is that it still is the challenge process that will correct the map. There's nothing the FCC is currently doing or could do to take that task on itself.
Well, we've done a number of things. Our Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force has been in 9 states. We've been investigating on the ground as best we can. We don't have the personnel, the thousands of people that would be necessary to go around the entire United States. We've relied, as I said, on a wide variety of actors, private sector, state and local officials, and others to make those challenges.
I don't want to discount anything the chairman said. I agree that extending the deadline is a good idea, but I fundamentally agree with you that our maps are flawed. And over the next 10 years, we are going to distribute $4.5 billion to rural communities. If we get it wrong, they're going to pay a really big price. They won't get the funding they need. So in addition to extending it, and our process is really cumbersome. You've got to download all these data from the FCC, go onto their portal at USAC. You've got to get a variety of handsets, and then at half a kilometer distances, go and test signal strength and latency, upload it back, put it on a grid, get it certified by an engineer. It is difficult. We should be adding to this with our own efforts. We could do that if we took some of the FCC field offices and had them go out and did testing. We can ask our colleagues at the Universal Service Administrative Company who are already planning on testing after the fact to go out and also do spot checks. And then we can take advantage of our Measuring Broadband America program, where we've got like 200,000 consumers around the country who have downloaded a test to see if broadband is available through wirelessly in their communities, and see if we can exercise them to help us too, because the more data we get here to make it more accurate, the better off rural communities will be.
Thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel, and please consider me an ally in any efforts to do that, to demonstrate how important this issue is and yet how wrong the process is. The Kansas Farm Bureau is taking it upon itself to go out and do the testing. I applaud them for doing that, but it doesn't seem like it's a responsibility of the Kansas Farm Bureau to correct a map developed by the FCC and information provided to it. Mr. Chairman, I would offer to you and to the ranking member, if I can help in any way to get the 5th commissioner confirmed in the United States Senate, I am interested in seeing that we have a 2nd Kansan serving on the FCC.
Hear, hear.
Sounds like an inside deal to me. Thank you, Senator Moran. Senator Cantwell's up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the hearing. And this is for any of the commissioners. Last week, Google's smartphone service stores came out that it stores user locations even when the privacy settings are adjusted to shut these features off. And while the company asked for permissions for users to share location information, it does not stop those tracking services when the user pauses the location history. Now, Homeland Security has received reports of nefarious actors having exploited weaknesses in cell phone network operation systems and targeting communications of Americans. Does the FCC need to be doing more in this issue and protecting consumers by correcting some of these issues with your oversight? Yes.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. The answer is yes. Protection of the safety of life and property is in the very first sentence of the Communications Act. Cybersecurity is no longer some siloed notion. As we connect everything in our lives, it is part of our basic cyber hygiene to make sure we consider how we can be more safe and secure and less vulnerable to difficult actors. We've got issues right now with stingrays in this town, adjacent to big federal buildings like the White House that are using our airwaves. We should be investigating that. It's a violation of the Communications Act for them to do that, and there are interference issues that are real there and something we should be looking at. We should be looking at the situations you described where wireless carriers are giving out geolocation information without customer consent. That's a violation of our customer proprietary network information rules. And we should also be looking at technologies like SS7, which we know are vulnerable. From front to back, we need to be thinking about cybersecurity in everything we do.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. I hope some of your other fellow commissioners agree. Can we get comments?
Senator, I agree with the issue. The position you've taken that cybersecurity is an important issue, and that is why we have worked very well with the Department of Homeland Security. I personally have worked with the DHS Undersecretary Krebs, who handles a lot of these issues, and have had briefings in our own SCIF on some of the cyber issues that we see emerging, and would like to work with you on that if there's a way forward.
Well, I think last time you were here, you were more or less drawing a line saying that the life and property issue, but that you didn't have a real role in cybersecurity. So I hope you're rethinking that, because I think the continued evolution here is we need the FCC to play an aggressive role. I love that Commissioner Rosenworcel used the word hygiene. That's the word we use so much in our state, that the challenge we face is that it is, if you look at what happened with the Equifax, they even had a patch, and a guy who was supposed to fix the patch and apply it didn't do it, and now all these people are without security. So I hope the same can be said of the FCC in focusing on what it wants to require here so that consumers are better protected, but more importantly, that this outlet is not just a front door portal for more attacks.
And Senator, if I might, as I said at the earlier hearing, our challenge is that we are a creature of Congress. We can only exercise the authority that Congress has entrusted to us. Section 1 of the Communications Act is a purpose section. It doesn't grant us operative authority. And that's why, under current law at least, we are to operate in a consultative role with the Department of Homeland Security, with the intelligence community, and others. We are doing that and to develop best practices and the like, and DHS just last week, I believe, or earlier this week rather, announced that they have a new cybersecurity center that they are standing up to help address these issues. We look forward to working with them and with anyone who's interested in these issues.
Well, I serve on several committees where we've had hearings, and I so appreciate this committee joining in that. But I think I want to hear from Commissioner Rosenworcel. Do you disagree? Do you think there's something you could do now? You don't need a new authority or bill by us to do that?
I do not think we need additional authority, though we would always welcome it. I think it is just part of our duty as public servants. The first duty of the public servant is the public safety. We should look at our statute and find every way to make sure that cybersecurity is part of everything we do.
Well, I think we no doubt are just going to have to keep upping the aggressive nature of helping here, because obviously wherever people can get in is where they're going to get in. And I think some of this information very, very important. But thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Commissioner Rosenworcel, net neutrality has been the governing principle of the Internet up until now, until the FCC overturned those rules. Chairman Pai has been saying, well, the sky is not falling. But I'd like your insight into whether or not, at this point, we would expect broadband providers to start to set up fast and slow lanes, knowing that there's a court proceeding that has not been completed, and knowing that the Congressional Review Act that I authored has already passed in the Senate and is now pending over in the House. So I'd like to get your insight with regard to whether or not you agree that no changes that are significant have taken place yet, because the whole process has not been completed.
I think you're right, Senator. I mean, just look at what happened in the aftermath of our decision. Millions of Americans know what the FCC is. I bet you they didn't before. We've had a Congressional Review Act here in the Senate. There's one pending in the House. We've got 23 state attorneys general suing us, 6 governors who've issued executive orders, 3 states that have actually passed their own laws and legislation pending in 30 more states, what you're seeing is the American public angry about what happened here, and I am certain that providers are careful in light of that.
Okay, now let me move on to the children's television proceeding that has now begun at the FCC. I'm the author of the Children's Television Act of 1990. Ultimately, it requires three hours a week of educational and informational programming for all children in America on free over-the-air broadcasting. So there's a consideration to reduce the number of hours, from 3 to some other number. There's also consideration of the concept that it wouldn't even be regularly scheduled. So kids necessarily or their parents wouldn't know what time it's on in order to go to that program. Now, the problem, of course, is that we have a very high percentage of minorities in America, Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, who do not have cable, who do not have broadband, high-speed broadband, so they're reliant upon free over-the-air television. And so this nutrition for the brain, which is the educational and informational programming that the law requires, is absolutely essential. So could you talk to any concerns you might have about what we need to guarantee stays in place in order to make sure these kids get what they need?
Sure. Listen, I'm a mom. I know that my kids watch programming differently than I did when I was a child. But if you look at the data, what you learn is that a quarter of the low-income households with kids under 8 in this country don't have broadband. And many of the houses that do don't have unlimited plans. This idea that everyone's just going to stream educational content for children easily in a cost-free way is flawed. It's okay to decide we want to modernize these rules. We should want to modernize these rules. But we've got to be careful about how we are reducing the positive impact that the Children's Television Act could really have on the households that need it most.
And I agree with you. I don't have a problem with going back and reviewing what has evolved over the years, but I also don't want to do it without focusing upon all the kids, tens of millions of them, who are going to be in a different situation than families that look like the ones that are on this panel are sitting at the witness table today. Okay? They're in a different situation. They need access to this kind of programming, and I would hope that as we're going through this whole redo of the children's television rules, that we're mindful of those children. Okay? They need the same kind of information we were given access to growing up. Finally, I'd like to come to you, Mr. Chairman. That's on robocalls. That's just an incredible issue that just drives people crazy in our country. And that's why I authored the Telephone Consumer Protection Act of 1991, so that we'd have rules that could protect people from just, especially around supper time, just having their lives interfered with in a way that drives them crazy. So I know the D.C. Circuit struck down the rules that were put on the books by the FCC. So can you give me some kind of guidance as to how you're going to be robust in putting protections on the books?
Appreciate the question, Senator. We are taking a two-tack approach. One is with respect to our regulations, and the other is with respect to enforcement. I'll tackle the second piece first. We have taken the most aggressive action in the agency's history across any area to address this issue. We've made it our #1 consumer protection authority. The largest fines ever imposed in the FCC's history have been imposed against robocallers. With respect to regulation, as you pointed out, the D.C. Circuit vacated the previous 2015 rules. We've issued a public notice and are still taking public input on what the appropriate way forward is with respect to auto dialers, reassigned numbers, and revocation of a consent. And we look forward to developing the record further with the staff and trying to assess the way forward.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate that. And Commissioner O'Reilly, I was going to come to you next, but my time was running out. But I want to work with you on this children's television issue so that we get the right answer for every child in America. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank the commissioners for being here today. I do really appreciate it. I particularly want to thank Commissioner Carr for visiting Indiana some months ago. We had a really productive day visiting some rural communities that are having challenges with respect to connectivity. Downtown Indianapolis, I thought that was quite interesting, certainly to me, as wireless carriers are utilizing spectrum to deliver new 5G services. And we visited West Lafayette, Purdue University, that is leading the world, I would say, with respect to advancing smart agriculture through the latest technology. There's a common theme as we went around the state. High-speed connectivity leads to jobs and economic growth and better health and education. And I want to commend you, certainly on the healthcare front, for taking action. The proposed Connected Care pilot program to support delivery of telehealth services for people of modest means is really important to me and the people of Indiana. With regard to this pilot program, do you foresee the FCC studying the overall impact this will have on healthcare expenditures, or it could have, as a result of increased access to telemedicine services for people of modest means?
Senator, thank you for the question. Absolutely. And you actually deserve some credit for this. There was an idea that you threw out during that trip, which is if we are investing in these telehealth technologies and there's a direct reduction in Medicaid expenditures, how do we capture that savings in a beneficial way when it comes either to more telehealth or more broadband deployment? That's something that we ended up including in the NOI, and we're seeking comment on how to do that.
Yes, so if we invest intelligently, we can avoid government expenditures. We might be able to set that money aside in the future in a significant way in escrow and then pay back those at the private level who might actually make these investments. So I see some exciting possibilities here. We're doing this as well in the social realm through so-called social impact bonds or social impact partnerships. So this is a variant of that. What results as a follow-up have you seen to date for similar telehealth programs?
We've seen tremendous positive results. The one pilot that I saw in Ruralville, Mississippi, they saw results that if only 20% of the state's diabetes population enrolled in that program, it would be a $189 million reduction in the state's Medicaid expenses, not to mention, obviously, improve patient outcomes.
Well, it's very encouraging. How do we ensure that we're not just replicating existing government programs, whether it's through the FCC or USDA or through one of the other constellation of government entities we have out there?
Thank you, Senator. This is another good question, and we've teed up very specific asks in our notice of inquiry about accounting and metrics and how we make sure that we're not duplicating funding and that we can coordinate, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of different agencies that are involved in this space, and we don't want to be duplicating efforts. We want to stretch the dollars as far as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to turn quickly to the advancement to win the race to 5G, something we all are supportive of, I believe. Commissioner Carr, I mentioned our trip to Indianapolis. We went on a walking tour that day of existing small cell wireless deployment that AT&T has implemented there in downtown Indianapolis. And then just a couple of days ago, Verizon made an exciting announcement. They said Indianapolis would be one of the first 5G cities in the United States, and that should launch later this year, I understand. Now, companies, they don't make decisions like this in a vacuum. State and local regulations, I hear, make a huge impact. So I just want to get your perspective on that. Do you believe that the actions of our state and local governments were key in facilitating these investments? And if so, shouldn't this be done on a national scale to incentivize investment in all communities, big and small alike?
Senator, thank you. I agree. When we were in Indiana, in Indianapolis, we met with the governor. We talked about the policies that have been put in place at the state level, some pretty basic common sense guardrails, and that is the incentive that created the environment that you see multiple nationwide providers leading their 5G deployments in that state. So the idea that some basic common sense rules of the road are going to attract and incentivize investment, we're seeing exactly that pay off for a lot of Hoosiers right now.
What else should the FCC be doing to expedite the process for deploying small cells that are necessary to win this race to 5G?
We have a proceeding right now where we're looking at some basic common sense ideas. Some of the ideas that we've seen in Indiana are ones that have stuck with us that we're looking to see if we can build on so that we can get deployment not just in the biggest of big cities, but to every community.
I'll be brief with respect to my last question here, Chairman Pye. It relates to Hoosier Broadcasters. They have you, as you're likely aware, they've expressed great anxiety over this channel repack, and this committee has already done some really good work on this front, so I want to acknowledge that. But now it's crunch time, as it were, and phase one of the repack is beginning to move forward in earnest. So how closely is the FCC monitoring the progress of tower crews, and what's the backup plan for when the arbitrary timetable slips because of, for example, weather or other unforeseen circumstances?
So thank you for your question, Senator. We do have a transition plan in place to ensure that every one of the 10 phases proceeds smoothly. In addition, we've built some give in the system, so to speak. So, for example, if a broadcaster, for reasons outside of its control, is not able to go through the process appropriately, we have a process to grant waivers, for example, to extend other sort of regulatory discretion, you might say, to make sure that they're held harmless. But we've also adopted recently a notice of proposed rulemaking to implement some of the authority that Congress recently gave us with respect to low-power TV stations, translators, and the like, and FM stations, radio stations as well, to make sure that we address their issues also.
I don't think you addressed this, so I'm going to very quickly. What process does the Commission have in place to ensure that if a broadcaster is being moved to a different channel, is unable to meet that deadline for that phased move through no fault of their own, is there some sort of process that the Commission has in place to accommodate or allow these channels, these broadcasters to stay on their current channel?
There is. So there is a waiver process that I mentioned. In addition, we have special temporary authority, or STA, that can be granted. If I remember correctly, it is to stay on a channel that another broadcaster who participated in the auction has vacated, and where there's not a wireless licensee that is occupying it. We have the ability to grant an STA in those situations.
Thank you much.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Hassan.
Thank you. I thought that was the case, but just checking. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for having the hearing, and to our ranking member as well. And thank you to the panel for being here today. Commissioner Rosenworcel, I wanted to ask you a question following up on a line that I think Senator Wicker began to cover with Chairman Pye. And Chairman Pye included in his testimony a discussion of net neutrality and quoted from a Washington Post piece from February of this year, which gave the claim, and I think Senator Wicker mentioned this, that the FCC's repeal of net neutrality rules would slow down internet traffic speeds, and the article gave it 3 Pinocchios. So I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert the full article into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Because the full piece goes on to state that the internet traffic hasn't slowed yet. The piece goes on to say, and I quote, "That could change in time. As the DC Circuit said, broadband companies could make more money from paid prioritization, and it's common sense to think they might try it. These providers have the ability and the incentive to slow down or speed up internet traffic, and they've engaged in these practices in the past." So, Commissioner Rosenworcel, is there anything that would stop an ISP from blocking certain websites and content right now, given the FCC's rollback of net neutrality rules?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. The answer is no. We gave them the legal right to block websites and censor online content. I mean, I don't think that's a good thing, but I do know this. Now that they have the legal right, all they have to do is combine it with their existing business incentives and technical ability, and I think history will demonstrate if you've got legal right, business incentive, and a technical ability, it will happen.
And thank you for that. How will this impact consumers and my state and consumers across the country who rely on the internet as an even playing field for business and for innovation?
Yeah, it's not good for anyone who consumes or creates online. We're adding another gatekeeper and toll online. We could have them build the internet into a fast lane for some and slow lane that's bumpy for the rest of us. I don't think that's the openness that has led our internet economy to thrive.
Thank you very much. Chairman Pye, another topic that I'd like to cover. The last time you testified before this committee, you frankly struggled to respond to a very basic question about whether you believe the press is the enemy of the people, as President Trump continues to assert. Since that hearing, more reporters have been roughed up and assaulted. The administration has shut down or shut certain reporters out of press conferences, and the president's rhetoric against the media has increased. So today, the media is fighting back with words. Today, in a coordinated effort, over 350 newspapers published editorials decrying this rhetoric and standing up for the freedom of the press. So my question to you and the entire panel is, and I'd just like a yes or no, do you believe the president's rhetoric is harmful to the values enshrined in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution?
Senator, as I answered last year, in response to your letter, I do not believe the media are the enemy of the people.
And is the president's rhetoric harmful to the values enshrined in our First Amendment, yes or no?
I'm not going to make comments on people's political comments on either side of the aisle. I'll simply say that this FCC has proven that it will stand on the side of the First Amendment in all its forms.
Well, I think there are several reporters who might differ with you on that. Mr. O'Reilly.
I think that the First Amendment and the ability of press and journalists to respond to the circumstances are stronger than anyone's critique, any particular person's, no matter who they may be.
So you don't think the president's rhetoric is harmful to the First Amendment?
I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment about the President of the United States on this context, but I think the Constitution, First Amendment, and the journalistic integrity is stronger than anyone's critique. And
so the First Amendment is the only amendment in our Constitution that singles out a particular industry as absolutely vital to our freedom and our democracy, and yet when the President of the United States, who swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America, says that very industry is the enemy of the people, you don't think that's harmful?
no, I said I don't believe, and I've said this previously, I don't believe that comment that he made was accurate. I don't, just like Chairman Pai, I agree that they're not the enemy of the people. I've said that before. However, I believe that the strength of journalists is stronger than any criticism of any one person, no matter who they may be.
Again, I think there are members of the press who might differ with you. At least the question is it harmful? And I'm not gonna get in a debate with you. I think your reluctance to answer speaks for itself. Mr. Carr.
Senator, thanks for the question. The First Amendment operates as a restraint on the government. The idea is that we don't put a thumb on the scale in favor of one speaker or the other. The whole purpose of the First Amendment is to encourage strong, robust, perhaps rough in some situations, discourse. At the FCC, my job is to act consistent with the First Amendment in every single thing that I do, and act consistent with the First Amendment rights of the media and the journalists, and I can commit to you that I'll continue to do that.
Well, and I'll continue to note the avoidance of the question I asked Commissioner Rosenworcel.
This is simple. This is easy. Yes, it's harmful.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you all for being here today, and Chairman Pai, in regards to consultation with Indian tribes, I commend those activities, and I hope you continue to do them. I think there are a lot of agencies within government that don't understand consultation. I think it's really important, so I appreciate you doing that. Being down the line and asking questions, I got to hear a lot of conversation about the maps. The maps stink, basically. And I don't know that the process that you've got to take care of the maps is going to work. In other words, I'm sitting here thinking, if I get a text to go out, does that mean I have coverage? And if I get a text to go out on one side of my house but not on the other side of my house, does that constitute coverage? If it's a voice call and the same thing, does that constitute coverage? Because quite frankly, that's exactly my world. I can send texts depending on where the sun is in the sky, basically. And I can get voice calls sometimes depending on which direction I'm driving the tractor, okay? So in rural America, whether you're talking about Montana or South Dakota or anywhere else, that's where it's at, and we've got to get those maps very quickly. I agree with Jessica. It will result in a big spending of a lot of money that will be unnecessarily spent. The other thing I would say in regards to the robocalls, you had said that you've been very aggressive on this issue. I can tell you personally, and my constituents have seen an incredible increase of robocalls over the last couple of years. I don't know if that's because of the D.C. Circuit Court decision or some other reason, but we got to shut them down. They are an incredible nuisance, and whatever you can do, and if you need more jurisdiction from us, please let us know, because I don't think anybody around this circle in a bipartisan way would not give you the power you need to shut this stuff down, because it is incredibly a big nuisance. The other thing I would just say, and this is a question, it deals with 5G. I am happy that 5G, that Verizon's going into Indianapolis. I am very concerned that it'll never come to Montana. We have advocated to put 5G into our biggest town billings, yet we have gotten no response whatsoever. So here's my question. As we work to get 5G, and I think all of us want to have 5G throughout the country, what happens to the places who have no G?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question, Senator. This is part of the reason why I'm so passionate about rural broadband, is that I believe 5G could, in fact, help us close that digital divide. I recently met with Ted Rappaport.
So here's the question, though. Yeah. So we invest 5G in Indianapolis and Houston and Miami and New York City and LA and San Francisco. You're getting the drift?
Mm-hmm.
We still don't have a G where I live. What happens there? Are we still going to invest to build out those systems?
Senator, that's precisely the reason why we've been modernizing our rules to build that business case for 5G in rural areas, to get the infrastructure in place, to get the spectrum out there, to allow carriers, especially small ones like VTEL that I referenced in my statement about rural Vermont. This enables them to make the investments to get rural 5G, to make rural 5G a reality.
I think it's going to take more than rules. It's going to take some sort of a push, to be honest with you. Because as we talked before the hearing started, we all get pushed to population centers because of this is the way it works. That's where the people live. But the truth is, we've got to figure out some way to push out service into rural America. And so in that regard, what is the FCC's definition of rural?
We have a variety of, we have a definition that's pretty arcane. I'd be happy to share it with you afterward. I can't remember the specific language.
Is it 500,000 people?
No, no. It's essentially, it tracks some other agencies' definitions of rural, and so I can't remember the specific definition off the top of my head.
Well, I mean, I just think it's really important as you guys go through your rulemaking process. We will never get 1G if we're focused on 5G in Houston.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't be focused on 5G. Go ahead.
Well, I want to say that's the purpose of Mobility Fund Phase 2, is to get everyone to 4G. And so the money that we're spending and why the maps are so important and the challenge process that I asked for, that is to get everyone to 4G.
Yep. But let me tell you, you're never going to get your maps done with your challenge process. And I will tell you why.
I don't disagree. No, I don't
Because
disagree.
I'm one of those guys that don't have it, and I don't even understand the damn challenge process.
No, I don't disagree with you.
Okay.
We've had some problems with the challenge process. I'm glad there is a challenge process. I wanted a more robust one.
If there's one thing, and I never want to put words in the committee's mouth, that I heard here today, the maps stink, and we've got to be more proactive about getting them fixed, and you can't depend on the Kansas Farm Bureau to do it.
No, I agree. I think one of the things we need to do is work with the providers. We've been trying to answer the question.
The problem is the providers created this problem by showing you a map that's covered in red. Where I live, it's covered in red. There ain't even pink where I live.
I guess I shouldn't have said providers. I should outside parties. There are many who are working in the challenge process.
Okay.
We've tried to answer the question for them rather than work with them.
Okay, just one real quick thing, and by the way, I do appreciate it. This is very parochial. Do you have a bunch of staff behind you? I assume you do. Raise your hands. No? No staff? Damn it.
I think they're afraid to raise their hands. So.
They're afraid to raise their hands. We've got a situation with a Woodman School and with the Missoula School District. We all talked about health care and schools, how important broadband is. These folks still aren't getting their service. They need it. One of them's a rural school. One of them's not, by Montana standards, a rural school, but it's a rural school too by national standards. I'd appreciate it if your staff would take a look at Woodman and Missoula County schools to make sure that they get what they need so our kids can get a fair shake at a 21st century economy.
Happy to do that, Senator. If I might very, very briefly, just in response to the previous issue.
Yep.
Here's the fundamental issue on Mobility Fund Phase 2.
Yep.
Right now, we are spending over $300 million every year to subsidize a fourth, a fifth, or even a sixth competitor in a part of the country that already has private investment. And the evidence suggests that states like Montana are getting short shrift. They don't get any money through that process. That's why we're trying to engage in this process.
I got to tell you, that's why I wondered about, and I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, your definition of rural, because we've got a situation in Montana where an outfit, and I'll call them out by name because they're not doing their job, Frontier got money 2 years ago. They haven't spent it. And Libby has no service. And so even the places that do have a provider aren't spending the money to get it out. We got to kick somebody's ass, truthfully. So thank you. Thank you for your work, by the way, all of you.
We'll certainly consider that figuratively, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Tester. And I think what you guys are hearing is a bipartisan concern about the maps.
making sure that we are accurate and that we're not overbuilding and that those areas that truly need the help are getting it. Next up is Senator Klobuchar.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Now we're going to switch to a Minnesota nice way of saying the same thing, although I love Senator Tester's approach. I was just out and did a bunch of broadband meetings in rural Minnesota, way up on the Canadian border. And to me, it is such a switch from 10 years ago when people were just asking to get some kind of service so they could send an email to their grandkid. And now they're worried about their very livelihood because our farmers have to be able to use precision agriculture to do business. You know this. And so the question Senator Thune asked about the overbuilding, a big issue raised, because we are in some areas just aren't getting the help they need. And I just implore you all to look at that issue. The second thing, and I know you agreed to address the Universal Service Fund money issues by the end of the year, incredibly important. Senator Thune as well as Senator Fisher and I have led a number of efforts to push that. You know that. I appreciate your first effort, but we need to do more. And then secondly, I guess I would ask this of you, Commissioner Rosenworcel. You've expressed concerns that the FCC's recent inquiry on the broadband report may not accurately portray service in rural areas. Do you want to quickly expand on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. Listen, we continue to take data in based on whether or not there is one subscriber in a census block, and if one subscriber in a census block has it, we assume broadband's available throughout. And anyone who's visited a rural community knows that's probably not the case. We have got to stop just trying to pull this information together in Washington with carriers. We need to start going out to the American public and figuring out a way to crowdsource their assistance and their help so we get this right.
Anyone else want to respond? Chairman.
Thank you for the question, Senator. As I appreciate, based on my visit to Madelia, among other places, that you might serve the core of Madelia, but on the outskirts, even if it's in the same census block, it's not served. That's part of the reason why the FCC has an ongoing proceeding to figure out how to modernize its Form 477 and other processes to have a more accurate picture of where coverage is and where it isn't. And I know the issue is the same up in the Iron Range as well.
Very good. Thank you. Our rural call completion, and I know that you just have announced that you're starting this registry for intermediate service providers to increase accountability. This is an issue that we took on a bipartisan basis, Chairman Thune and Senator Tester and a number of other people on this committee. I think you know the problem here. It's just unbelievable that these calls were being dropped, and we had the proof, and you had the proof of it. And so I guess this week you're starting this registry, which we appreciate. Could you talk about how will the recently established rules help improve call completion rates in rural areas? And we have a deadline of February 26, 2019 for the service quality standards. Do you think that can be met?
Senator, thanks for your leadership on this issue. It's critical in some of these rural communities, especially for smaller businesses that rely on voice calls to get the job done, quite literally. We do believe, with respect to the second component of your question, that we'll be able to move forward with those by February of 2019. And with respect to the first, our hope and expectation is that it will improve rural call completion rates by creating this registry, by requiring covered providers to work with intermediate providers who are part of that registry. We're making sure that every link in the chain, so to speak, has accountability, either directly to the FCC or indirectly through the covered care provider who is carrying those long-distance calls. And so our hope is that the service that people take for granted in Minneapolis will be the same one that people can rely on in Madelia.
Okay. Anyone want to add on that one? Okay. The Rural Spectrum Accessibility Act, Senator Fisher and I have introduced that. It was recently signed into law, thank you, Mr. Chairman, as part of the Mobile Now Act. And the provision requires the FCC to explore ways to provide incentives for wireless carriers to lease unused spectrum to rural or smaller carriers. Could you talk about how quickly we can get that rulemaking going?
Appreciate the question, Senator. Our staff is working diligently on that legislation, and I understand that there's a March 23rd, I believe, deadline for the FCC to take action, and I have every expectation that our staff will be able to present an order that comports with that time frame.
Okay, and then the dig once policy, something I've worked with Commissioner Rosenworcel on, that was also signed into law as part of the Mobile Now Act. Could you talk about how this could reduce the cost of deployment if we did this, and any thoughts you have on it?
Sure. Well, first thought is you've passed a lot of legislation in this last bill. The Dig Once Act is important, because if you decide that when you open up the roadways, you throw in some fiber, you only add 1% to the cost of a transportation project, but you secure a community's future because they will always have the broadband facilities that they are going to need. And it's also nice because you don't have to rip up the roads multiple times. So it is a low-cost way to ensure that broadband gets more places.
Okay, one last question. T-Mobile Sprint merger. I know you're looking at this, so I'm not going to ask specific questions, but one of the claims made was that the network would be superior in breadth and depth to anything that Verizon and AT&T could offer, and that was necessary to enable the U.S. to win the global race to 5G. Do you think further consolidation of wireless carriers is necessary to make deployment of 5G networks economically feasible?
I want to be cautious about a proceeding that's before us right now, but it's certainly moving from 4 providers to 3 is a hard case for consumers, and they're going to have to demonstrate how prices won't go up and innovation won't go down.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. You didn't get to your question about getting Vikings games in every corner of the state.
I actually had that question, and I'm going to be asking that in writing because I thought it looked just a little too parochial, and I didn't want to hurt the feelings of those senators that represent states that don't have pro football teams.
We have the same number of Super Bowl championships as you. Senator Gardner's up.
Wow. That was really good, Mr. Chairman. That was really good. I guess I can start right there. Why do the people of southwestern Colorado have to watch Dallas Cowboys? We'll work on that. Thank you. We're about to violate the number of Kansas quotas on this committee, on the commission too. So, that, as a Coloradan, I have grave concern with the next member of the FCC adding too many Kansans to the board here. Commissioner, Chairman Pai, just a quick question for you. Thank you very much for the work that you have done on rural broadband and the dividend that we've talked about in terms of making sure that we expand access into rural areas. You've made a particular effort to talk about higher frequency bands, the race to 5G, which that's critical to, and making more efficient use of spectrum. Senator Hassan and I have introduced a bill called the Airwaves Act, as you know, that takes the opportunity to set up a pipeline of spectrum, but also the rural dividend provisions that you've been a champion of, and I'm grateful for that, which could provide as much as $6 billion if it follows similar auctions to rural broadband deployment and development infrastructure. Could you talk a little bit about new spectrum opportunities, the importance of doing it in a timely manner, and other bands that you may be considering taking action with?
Sure. First, thanks, Senator, for your and Senator Hassan's leadership on that issue. That rural dividend, had it been in place since the FCC instituted competitive bidding, we would have gotten more money through that process than the entire mobility fund. So we're talking about a serious amount of money that could be closing that digital divide in rural America. With respect to bands that we're looking at, a whole bunch of them. For example, recently we started a proceeding with respect to the Educational Broadband Service, or EBS, which is 2.5 spectrum. Senator, looking to the future, Commissioner O'Reilly has taken the lead on 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, which we hope to be able to move on relatively soon. As I pointed out earlier in the colloquy, we're looking at the C-band, 3.7 gigahertz spectrum. A 6 gigahertz spectrum is something I'm very interested in. I thank Chairman Thune and all the members of this committee for supporting action through the Mobile Now Act to encourage us to take a look at unlicensed use in the 6 gigahertz band. I cannot tell you how much work I and our staff have been putting in to try to get that across the finish line. And in addition, we've been looking at very high bands, 24 gigahertz, 28 gigahertz we're auctioning in November, 37, 39, 47 next year. In addition, I wanted to make sure that we had a space for innovators to use. So we've teed up a notice above 95 gigahertz, spectrum that was previously thought to be unusable. And we're saying, look, here's a bunch of spectrum. Tell us what will work for both unlicensed and licensed uses. And I'm hopeful that the smart engineers and technologists out there can come up with a unique way similar to what they did with Wi-Fi in 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. And we can't anticipate where technology is going to take us. We do know that it could be useful if we give them the tools.
And thank you, Chairman Pai. And I too, just to
reiterate what's been said by multiple members of the committee here. I live in rural Colorado. In fact, I'm probably one of 0.00% of the population that live more than 60 miles away from a Starbucks. But you know, if you look at the map, again, you look at the map, and I live in a well-covered area. You can get 5 bars in my hometown. It's just not on my phone. And so I think that's the
might have to
what
steal
we
that.
have to continue to focus on. Commissioner O'Reilly, you've also been a champion of finding new ways to innovate in mid-band spectrum. We have to have this to focus on, well, our spectrum policy needs to focus on low-band, mid-band, and high-band spectrum to make sure that we have licensed, unlicensed services across a range of technologies, fixed, wireless, satellite, Wi-Fi, you name it. How close are we to finalizing a pathway forward on a mid-band proposal?
Well, thank you for your leadership, because your legislation, Airwaves Act, includes this and is very aggressive, and it's much appreciated. We just, a couple months ago, issued the NPRM, so it's going to take us a little bit of time to get to that point. There are a lot of tough conversations to work through and figure out the right path. There are many ideas that we put forward in that item, and we're going to have to make sure that all the existing contractees are taken care of. And so there's a number of principles I've outlined, but I think that it is incredibly important that we free up the C-band downlink band, in addition to the 6 gigahertz band, with the C-band uplink. So I think both of those are going to be important, and I think we can do that in a short amount of time, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Sooner is more important than later, correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Commissioner Carr, thank you for coming to Colorado not too long ago. Thanks for your commitment in rural broadband as well, and just commend you for the work that you've been doing on telehealth. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to visit Swedish Hospital, which is a certified stroke center, premier stroke center in the United States. They have taken the average time it takes to diagnose a stroke and deliver the life-saving TPA treatment for a stroke patient. They can do it in 17 minutes now, and as we know, every minute when you're suffering a stroke is millions of neurons in your brain that are affected. So it's incredibly important. They've also developed a strong tele-stroke program. I was able at the hospital to visit my hometown of Yuma, Colorado, from the Swedish hospital with Dr. Chang, a renowned neurosurgeon. I visited with the emergency room in my hometown. They're part of this telestroke program. They're able to get close to that 17 minutes. What's remarkable about this, in terms of delivery of that local hospital TPA as they transfer them to the stroke center, what's remarkable about telehealth and strokes is they have been able to eliminate 80% of, I guess I may be using the wrong word here, but they've been able to eliminate 80% of the misdiagnoses related to strokes. That means 80% of the time, somebody who comes into the hospital thinking they may be having a stroke, they're not having a stroke. And that means that they're not calling the Flight for Life, which could be a $65,000 flight from my hometown to Denver, or other emergency services. There's a medical need for sure, but they're able to save that patient, keep them local perhaps, and avoid that 80% of the time when it comes to stroke. So telemedicine is incredibly important. Thank you for your work. I've run out of time here, but can we help you more in the effort that you're undertaking with telehealth?
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on this. The Airwaves Act is going to help by creating a spectrum pipeline. Your leadership on telehealth has been tremendously beneficial. You wrote the FCC a letter last month, and we were able to take action a few weeks later to stand up this new program. And as you say, time is brain when it comes to stroke specialties. And I'm glad that this is an FCC that has voted, among other things, to increase spending on telehealth by over $170 million a year. And we're seeking comment now on establishing a new program as well. We need to keep pushing in this direction.
Thank you, and we're out of time, Commissioner Rosenworcel, so if you would like to use somebody else's time to talk about the mobility and buses and broadband, that'd be great too. Thanks.
I do appreciate that you're working on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gardner. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. And let me just say, I also echo all of the comments we discussed and I've heard from my colleagues on access to rural broadband and opening those doors. I support telehealth. We have that happening right now in the state of Nevada. It's incredible, the resources that we can bring into our rural communities, from telemedicine to education to, believe it or not, access to our judicial system. I mean, it is phenomenal, and I think we do that by opening these doors through broadband. But let me before I get into the rural broadband, let me show you a map of actually the Las Vegas Valley. This was actually covered in a local paper, Las Vegas Review-Journal, and the map actually shows, the pink areas show a recent analysis of 4G wireless coverage gaps and weak spots that currently exist, and that's the Las Vegas Valley. That is the largest populated community rural or urban area in southern Nevada, about 2 million people. So I guess my question to you, Chairman Pai and the commissioners, how do we address this issue? How do we address the challenges that we see here where there are people that are living in urban areas where they cannot access the internet, or they're having dropped calls? In fact, there's a gentleman by the name of Steve Greenberg in Las Vegas who runs an important business from home. In the Las Vegas Review-Journal article, he says his calls have been dropping for the whole 8 years he's lived in his home. How do we address this?
Thank you for your question, Senator. 3 basic tools in the toolbox. Number 1, getting more spectrum out there for carriers of all kinds to use. That's the critical way to transmit this information after all. Number 2, infrastructure. Setting rules of the road that make it easier to deploy towers and small cells, the other guts of these networks that are critical. In a lot of those places, there might be some federal, state, or local restrictions that prevent that. Number 3, smarter subsidy programs. As I said in response to Senator Tester, for years the FCC had been subsidizing the 4th, the 5th, or even 6th competitor in a part of the country that already had service from the private sector. We need to refocus that effort on unserved parts of the country. And Las Vegas has gaps. I imagine in places like Elko is even worse. There you can't get a signal
I
at all.
haven't gotten to that yet.
Okay. No, but it's not just that. It's a public safety issue. I visited the Las Vegas 911 call center that took all those calls in the wake of the 2017 tragedy of the Mandalay Bay shootings. And when you hear that 83%, I believe it is, calls come from wireless phones every year, something like 90-some% in that case, it heightens the importance of this issue to make sure that everyone has access to that wireless phone with service when emergency strikes.
Thank you. I know, Ms. Rosenworcel, we've talked about this as well. You have any comments?
Yeah, I mean, 2 thoughts. First, this demonstrates very clearly we need better mapping with participation from the people who are on that map and don't have service, and the individual you described. But a second short-term idea is we should expand the use of signal boosters. They're small devices that can amplify existing networks. We have had restrictions on businesses and schools and some consumer use of them. We have an open proceeding now to remove some of those restrictions, and I believe that is something that could help with urban dead zones in a significant way. We should explore their greater use.
And can you comment, both of you, on digital redlining? And what can the FCC do about this and ensure us that you're addressing this issue where wireless companies do not solely benefit the neighborhoods that feed their bottom line, and we're getting the service to the neighborhoods that actually need it?
Senator, this is an issue that's important to me. In September of 2016, I targeted specifically the issue of digital redlining. I said, this is not acceptable. Every American deserves access to high-quality, high-speed internet access, and outlined a whole bunch of proposals for doing so, one of which I would commend to you and this body is Senator Capito and Senator Coon's bipartisan legislation, building on a proposal I made then called the Gigabit Opportunity Act. Essentially, you would target a geographic area as small as a city block or as large as a rural county. So long as the median income in that area was 75% or less of the national median, you would grant tax incentives to companies to build infrastructure in those areas. You would also relieve the payroll side taxes for employers who build jobs in those areas using those networks. That's one tool that Congress could use. It would be powerful in making sure that those parts of the map that the private sector is just overlooked because there's not a return on the investment could finally get on the grid once and for all.
Anything else?
The chairman has some good ideas, but here's what we could do. The FCC could comb through its 477 data and try to identify areas that look like they've been redlined, and we should open a proceeding and ask for stories from around the country so we can identify not just the rural areas that go without, but the urban areas that are having difficulty getting modern broadband service.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I notice my time is up. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. We have votes coming at noon. I have 4 members here still ask questions. If everybody stays on 5 minutes, I think we can probably get everybody in before we wrap. So next up is Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for your service. We've had a fair amount of discussion this morning about robocalls. I don't think anybody in this building or in this country would admit, at least, to favoring robocalls. They are a plague that seems to have universal condemnation. So I would like your commitment that you will support the measure that Senator Markey and I have introduced. It's called Repeated objectionable bothering of consumers on Phones Act, also Robocop. This bill would require phone companies to offer effective tools to block robocalls to consumers at no extra cost to them. It's been around for a while, so I presume you've had time to look at it, and I'd like your commitment that you'll support it, each of you, beginning with you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, I'm very supportive of efforts to encourage blocking. I'll have to take a look at our
If you could take a look at it, I don't want to spend time with an answer that is not a commitment to support it. You will take a look at it?
Absolutely, Senator. We always will provide technical assistance as needed.
Is there anyone here who will support it? Thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Yes.
Will the rest of you look at it? And can I have a commitment that you will get back to me within a week?
Yes, Senator.
Yes. If it moves the ball at all forward on this issue, then I'm all for it.
Thank you. Chairman Pai, during the FCC oversight hearing last year, you committed to informing Congress if the White House or anyone on behalf of the White House ever directed or advised you to take action in any matter. I believe you recall that testimony. Regarding the Sinclair Tribune merger, has anyone in the administration contacted you prior to or after the July decision?
Senator, no one has called from the White House to express a view. We received one status inquiry.
And who was that from?
From the counsel to the President.
When was it received?
I believe it was July 16th or 17th.
Could you provide the committee with a copy of the document?
There was no document. It was just a phone call.
Was it from the White House counsel himself?
Yes, sir.
Don McGahn?
Yes.
To you directly?
Yes.
And what was the substance of the conversation?
I just wanted to know what he saw something in the news, wanted to know what our decision was, or what the action was, proposed action.
Maybe you could repeat that. He wanted to know what the action was?
He just wanted to know what it was.
Well, since I have only a limited amount of time, I'd like from you a written summary of the conversation, if that's possible.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. Regarding the Lifeline program, as you well know, it's helped to ensure affordable telephone service for low-income Americans for over 30 years, including many, many veterans. In 2016, the FCC advanced this important mission to include broadband internet. Mr. Chairman, you opposed the Lifeline modernization order as a commissioner. Now, as chair, you have proposed to limit funding, service eligibility, and enrollment. These actions appear to be intended to make it more difficult for Americans to seek assistance from Lifeline and also, frankly, kick people off the program. For this reason, your proposals were widely criticized as harmful to vulnerable Americans, including many veterans groups. Will you commit to this committee today that no veteran will be kicked off the Lifeline program?
Senator, we are looking at ways to modernize our program to better serve consumers, including veterans who rely on it, and my commitment is to make sure we have a Lifeline program that does just that.
I'm wondering whether you can answer my question. Will you commit that no veteran will be kicked off the Lifeline program?
Again, Senator, I can't commit to something without the FCC having a chance to fully study the record, which we're in the process of doing. But my commitment is to make sure we have a Lifeline program that does serve that worthy interest.
Will you commit that all veterans who currently qualify under the program will continue to receive it?
Senator, that's one of the issues that we're working on now to make sure that the program serves consumers like that.
Why would you not make that commitment?
I can't think of any reason why we would want to kick off someone who's qualified for the program. Indeed, the very purpose of our reforms is to make sure that we include folks who are qualified for the service and that they get the funding they need, as opposed to the money going to unscrupulous wireless carriers who fleece the system.
My time has expired, but I'd like to follow up on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here, and thank thank you for participating with me in several events, both in the state and here in Washington, D.C. So I appreciate that. Chairman Pai, I want to ask you sort of a niche question, which we're all niched into what's happening in our individual states, as you would expect. But I'm concerned about the Commission's Mobility Fund in terms of the topography of a state such as ours. As you know, and many of you have been to West Virginia, we have a lot of hills and valleys, and it's difficult to, it's a lot more difficult to put service in than it would be, say, in Kansas, where it's flatter and easier. So it may make the deployment of the service more expensive and time-consuming for providers, and could potentially drive them to use their mobility fund resources in different locations. So I want the assurance that locations that are currently eligible and may become eligible through the challenge process are adequately funded by a formula that's adopted that takes topography into consideration.
I appreciate the question, Senator. Your topography is much more complex than my home states, and so that's part of the reason why we've included analysis of terrain, for example, to make sure that we take account of that unique situation.
Appreciate that in response to our request. Commissioner Carr, thank you for coming to our, we have our Senate Broadband, Rural Broadband Caucus. We've talked a lot about the deployment of telehealth and the things that we can see how advantageous that will be to many of us in rural areas and really across the country. What's the next step here in terms of making sure we're deploying this in the telehealth area as accurately as we should be?
Thanks for the question, Senator. We're pursuing sort of two tracks at the Commission. On the one hand, we've long been supporting broadband deployment to connected brick-and-mortar healthcare facilities. In fact, we've increased the funding on that portion. What we've just voted on earlier this month is to start the process of setting up a new program that would focus on a slightly different issue, which is how do we make sure that that connected care can stay with patients when they leave the facility, whether it's on their iPhone or on a tablet. That administrative process is running its course right now. We're taking comment, and my hope would be that we could stand that up as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a point of clarification, this is for anybody. When people say robocalls, and we all don't like them, does this include the spoofing call that you get? So is a robocall either somebody who robocalls you or somebody using a fake number to entice you to pick up the phone? Do you consider that a robocall as well?
Yes, Senator. Spoofing is perhaps the most pernicious of those because it mimics both the area code and sometimes even the prefix to make it appear as if a call is coming from your neighborhood when in fact it could be coming from another continent.
I know, I know, and and they also get the numbers lined up, so you might think it's your mother calling, and and then no, it's I need a student loan is what I need. So anyway, Commissioner Rosenworcel, thank you for coming to our Rural Broadband Caucus. I've joined on a letter with Senators King and House Representatives McKinley and Welch to the Department of Education to fully complete the research that Congress has requested in the Every Student Succeeds Act to develop strategies in order to close this homework gap. I was just at the opening of a brand new middle school in northern West Virginia, Brook Middle School. Each one of those children in 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade will have a Chromebook. The technology I've learned is it's not, we've gone beyond whiteboards now. We're into interactive smart TVs in every classroom. It's fascinating to watch. How are we going to be assured that when they take the Chromebook home with them, they're going to be able to complete their assignment? Or, this to me is the big challenge, I think, for areas, especially when we talk about the population that can't afford to actually purchase a Chromebook or whatever they would have, an iPad or whatever. It's just, they're going to have this. Can they use it?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for your work on this. According to the Senate Joint Economic Committee, there are 12 million students in this country who do not have broadband at home and can't get their homework done. I mean, it's the cruelest part of the digital divide. We have got to fix it. Right. There are some measures that can help, more Wi-Fi in more places, more low-cost broadband plans. Senator Udall and Senator Gardner have a bill to help put Wi-Fi on buses. And then I also think we have to explore how we can use the 2.5 gigahertz band, which has long been used for education purposes, to create a new incentive auction structure so that perhaps we can fund a program for wireless hotspots for those students to take home with their Chromebooks, because every child needs to be able to do their homework and no child should be left offline.
Right. Does anybody else have any comments on that, on the education aspect of this?
I'll just offer two quick points. I think Commissioner Rosenworcel is exactly right that EBS holds particular promise. I met on Tuesday with Northern Michigan University that's using some of that spectrum in an innovative way to supply internet access to places in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that otherwise wouldn't have service. And we also want to make sure that we promote as much of these kinds of reforms as possible, telehealth, E-rate, all the rest of it. These are critical tools, I think, for these rural communities.
Right. Thank you all. Thank you for your service. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be chairing here for a minute, but I'm going to call on myself. Sorry to my colleagues, but I want to focus where I know a lot of the discussion has been with regard to broadband in remote and extreme rural areas. A lot of us have that concern. It's an overriding concern of mine, and I want to begin with some compliments. I want to thank the commissioners. 2 years ago, I was very focused, and a lot of you were, on the Alaska plan, which kind of recognized that there's remote and then there's Alaska, and we're obviously extremely remote relative to any other state in the country. I also appreciate there's been a lot of visits. Commissioner Carr, thank you for just being up in my state just last week. I know you got around, and I know all of you have also been up there. And increasing the funding from $400 million to $575 million on the rural health care related issues, I think that's very important, and we need to continue that work. And I think you see broad bipartisan support on that. The ideas, Commissioner Riley, you've talked about remote areas funds and other things. I think we want to continue to work on that, and I think you're seeing strong bipartisan support. But I will say none of this matters if programs are not run with predictability and certainty and stability. The chairman's initial comments when he kicked off the hearing this morning really emphasized that. You probably saw this is a big issue for all of us. If a program doesn't have stability or certainty, then it's essentially you're kind of undermining the whole system. And in my state, we don't have stability. We don't have certainty. The rural health care program, unfortunately, from my perspective, has moved from being run in an ad hoc, constantly changing, move the goalpost manner, and is having a very negative consequences in Alaska. My state and I have spent countless, and I mean countless, hours on this issue with the FCC and its staff. It's an issue I've probably worked on with my team almost more than any other issue, particularly with your office, Mr. Chairman, and the results have been underwhelming and frustrating and completely unacceptable. The damage being done to this program in Alaska by the FCC's remarkably ad hoc approach hurts not just telecoms companies. You know, we're into FY18 and the 2017 reimbursements are still not happening, which is unbelievable to me, and their ability to invest their private sector capital, but the health clinics and most importantly the constituents that's meant to serve in some of the most impoverished places in America. So I will always support rigorous oversight of the program to ensure good stewardship, the useful and focus on taxpayer dollars of the Universal Service Fund, but stability, predictability, objective enforcement of the rules is critical for the program's integrity and carrying out its intent. So I'm going to ask each of you this basic question. Are you aware of the status of the 2017 rural health care applications in Alaska, and what specific steps or reforms are you able to commit to taking in order to ensure that the 2017 issues are not repeated next year or after? Already 6 healthcare providers, small rural providers in my state, have opted out of the program for next year because they have no idea if they're going to get the money. And it's probably going to be more. So I'd like an answer from each of you, starting with Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Yes, Senator, I recognize how important this program is to Alaska. I am aware of difficulties, and I can commit to you now that we should resolve them as expeditiously as possible and make sure that we don't continue to have them going forward.
Commissioner Carr.
Yes, sir, I'm aware of it, and I've been a voice inside the commission pushing to make sure we can get to resolution and get to stability going forward.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Yes, I agree with my colleagues on this exact point. I associate myself with Commissioner Rosenworcel's points.
And Mr. Chairman, again, my frustrations on this have exceeded almost any other issue I've worked on as a U.S. Senator. Most of it's come from your office.
Senator, appreciate your concern. As you know, we've had many conversations about that.
Too many.
And as have at our staffs. And I can commit to you, I'm obviously aware of the issue, and we are working diligently with one carrier in particular to resolve those issues.
This was stated essentially some version of that to me probably 8 months ago. And again, I've lost my patience, and we need to not only deal with what went on in 2017, but right now I have entire communities that are spooked because they have no earthly idea what the rules are. And we don't have predictability, you don't have people participating. And we don't have people participating in companies and clinics, then the people it's meant to help, my constituents. I was just out in a lot of these rural communities. These are amazing American citizens, but they're in very, very impoverished parts of the country. And this has been, I hear this from everybody. You got to do a better job. We want to work with you, but I am just tired of having this same conversation.
I couldn't agree more, Senator, which is why we resolved issues with respect to one company, and from the other, we're getting information from them still and looking to work through that to make sure we resolve these issues with respect to every fiscal year. And going forward, as you know, thanks to your leadership, we've increased the fund by 43% and included that inflation factor to mitigate this problem going forward.
Well, look, I appreciate the increasing of the funding, but stability, predictability, as the chairman stated in his, not just for Alaska, but for all of these programs, is critical, or you're not going to get people or companies to participate in. Thank you. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Pai, as you may recall from your confirmation hearing last year, we discussed your perspective about inmate calling services and protecting families and inmates from unjust and unreasonable inmate phone rates. Last July, before this committee, you made it clear that you did not and never have endorse unjust and unreasonable rates. Rather, you believe that while Congress has provided the FCC with authority to regulate interstate inmate calls, Congress had yet to provide the FCC with clear authority to address unjust and unreasonable intrastate inmate call rates. And while we have an honest disagreement over the scope of the FCC's authority in this space, I was pleased to find that we agree that Congress should provide this authority to the FCC. And I appreciated your commitment to this committee that you would, and I quote, welcome additional authority should Congress see fit to provide it. Chairman Pai, is this still your view?
Yes, Senator, it is.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Reilly, this is our first encounter. I'm glad we have this opportunity to finally meet, and I was pleased to read that you appear to share the views of your FCC colleagues that the prison payphone industry is extremely troubled. I completely agree that the unjust and unreasonable rates we find in intrastate inmate call rates represent an outrageous market failure. As you may know, I've been working with Senators Schatz, Booker, and Portman to advance our bipartisan Inmate Calling Technical Corrections Act. Our common sense resolution would fix this market failure and achieve just and reasonable rates by applying the longstanding Section 202 standard found in the Telecommunications Act to intrastate inmate calling rates, regardless of technology used, just as the FCC currently does for interstate inmate calls. Commissioner O'Reilly, do you share Chairman Pai's view that you would welcome this committee clarifying the FCC's authority to ensure just and reasonable rates apply to intrastate inmate calls just as it applies to interstate inmate calls?
Yes, I believe that anytime Congress addresses a matter, it provides clarity to the Commission, it's helpful. So if this is a path that the committee and the Congress wants to take, then I would be supportive and would implement whatever is put forward.
Thank you. Chairman Pai, our bipartisan coalition has been working with stakeholders to understand the challenges that inmates and their families face, as well as the safety and security challenges that faces law enforcement. Most of the input and feedback we've received has been helpful in narrowing the scope of our legislation to carefully clarify the law in the wake of the U.S. Court of Appeals decision. However, of all the stakeholder feedback we've received, there is one troubling viewpoint that I hope you can qualify. One stakeholder asserted that the FCC, and I quote, has shown that it is not capable of appropriately considering state and local issues and needs in its regulatory process. So they're questioning your ability to question state, local issues and needs in your regulatory process. They're arguing that the Commission should have no role in making sure intrastate inmate calling rates are just and reasonable. And I find this troubling if true. Chairman Pai, can you assure this committee that the FCC, under your leadership, is not only capable, but also appropriately considers state and local issues and needs in your regulatory processes?
Senator, I'm not aware of the nature of that objection, so I have to study it a little more carefully to understand the full context of it. But generally speaking, beyond this particular issue, I mean, we always try to take account of all relevant factors, including in this particular case, potentially state and local processes.
Thank you. Commissioner Rosenworcel, what are your thoughts when it comes to fixing the long-standing market failure that results in unjust and unreasonable intrastate inmate calling rates?
There are 2.7 million children in this country with a parent in prison, and most of them can't stay in contact because the cost of a single call is what you and I spend for our monthly plans. This is outrageous. We should be fixing it. We have tried on several episodes to do that with interstate ancillary fees, site commissions. We have had most of our work on this sent back to us. While I fully appreciate the additional help that you've offered us on intrastate rates, I believe the agency could be doing more right now on ancillary fees and interstate rates, but we have thrown up our hands and we have no proceeding that is ongoing, and we have refused to defend the agency's work to date. I think we should be doing more with the authority we have.
Thank you. And I just want to note for Mr. Chairman that there's clearly a strong consensus for addressing this long-standing problem. I hope this committee will advance the Inmate Calling Technical Corrections Act before the end of the year. I have many more questions about issues important to Illinoisans, robocalls, the Lifeline program, media ownership issues already covered by my colleagues, but in the interest of time, I will submit them for the record.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Senator Udall.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and really appreciate the commission being here today. And let me just first say, seems like New Mexico is getting a lot of attention. I know, Mr. Chairman, you're headed to New Mexico on Monday. Commissioner Rosenworcel just got back, I believe, a week or two ago, and then she came out earlier to visit on some issues that we had, which I think is great. So thank you for doing that. Let me also say to Commissioner Rosenworcel, thank you for the plug on the bill that Senator Gardner and I are working on. You know how important it is. I think you've seen this firsthand. When you have students that are commuting in these rural areas, sometimes on buses an hour and a half, 2 hours, tremendously important to get Wi-Fi in those buses and make sure that they are able to do their homework and we don't have a homework gap. Now, I watched a lot of this from my office, and I have to comment, especially in light of the fact that the president today is blasting away again at the Boston Globe, at the New York Times. Once again, his very just destructive behavior in terms of the First Amendment, in terms of freedom of the press. And I think this term he uses over and over again, being the press being the enemy of the people, has to be taken head on. And I really appreciate you, Commissioner Rosenworcel, taking it head on and answering the question earlier that I've asked several times. And I hope that we see the rest of the commission step up to the plate on this. I would really like to see that. I don't think there's any doubt that this is very, very harmful to our democracy, and you need to speak truth to power in these circumstances. I think it's a big duck to say you're not going to get into this. I mean, when this kind of behavior happens over and over again, day after day, we need to do everything we can at all levels of government. You're in a crucial position, and speak up against this. So I've done a lot of work to make sure we can free up spectrum currently being occupied by federal agencies, but I believe we should also know which spectrum is currently in use or not in use right now. And it's my understanding that until 2014, the FCC maintained a spectrum dashboard where anyone could pull up a map and determine the owner of the spectrum in their area. And I'm going to go down the line here. This is a yes or no question. Do you support the FCC relaunching the spectrum dashboard?
Senator, yes, subject to obvious resource constraints and any potential legal issues.
Yeah.
I'm
Commissioner
not
O'Reilly?
as familiar with it, but it sounds like a very good idea, so yes.
Yeah. Commissioner Carr?
Yes, Senator.
Yeah. Commissioner Rosenworcel. Thank you very much. And all of you know, we work very, very carefully with the tribes in our community. Some of you, I think, will be, I know Commissioner Rosenworcel has visited with the New Mexico tribes. I think you're also on your visit going to visit a tribe. The FCC recently finalized an order that would have curtailed, if not outright eliminated, reseller services in tribal areas. Indian country, including the Navajo Nation, widely opposed this order. The D.C. Circuit stepped in and stayed the FCC's order, finding that the FCC has, quote, identified no evidence of fraud or misuse of funds, and that the order could result in, a quote here again, tribal populations suffering widespread loss of vital telecommunication services. Now that the D.C. Circuit has preliminarily stayed this damaging order, will the FCC revisit its decision, and do you think it should revisit its decision?
Senator, we have a pending proceeding on this very issue, and we are still studying the record and trying to figure out the appropriate way forward.
Yeah. Do the other commissioners, do you agree with that? Do you have anything else to say?
It needs to be litigated out, but we're going to have to in one form or another, whatever the decision is accordingly.
I think we need to keep pushing forward and get more broadband deployed and more connectivity there.
Yeah.
Yes, everything we can do to improve connectivity on tribal lands is a step we should be taking.
Great. Thank you very much, and I'm going to give back a little time here to let others participate. Thank you.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you. As promised, I'm going to start by talking about the Packers. Don't want to disappoint, but I actually do want to cover a little bit of territory in the few minutes I have. I actually hear about this issue regularly from my constituents in the northwestern part of Wisconsin, and that's their inability to be able to get the programming they want. It's a political crisis when they can't get Packer games, I have to say. But it's because they live in one of the 13 Wisconsin counties that is assigned to an out-of-state media market, and primarily Minnesota. But there are a couple of counties in Wisconsin that get Michigan programming. Now, earlier this summer, I introduced the Go Pack Go Act, which actually would require cable or satellite or other video providers to give these Wisconsinites a local option. And while this may only impact people in these Wisconsin counties, as well as similarly situated ones in states across the country, I actually believe, very seriously, not only is the sports and entertainment that we are so passionate about in our state, but the local programming, news about events and current affairs that are relevant to them and their communities is vital. This committee and Congress have taken some important steps to address this problem in the past, and I hope that we'll continue to work towards solutions for more of those who are affected. Chairman Pai, I know the FCC has studied this issue, and do you agree that this continues to be a problem facing many Americans and something that you and we should be working to address? And if so, how can we work together to advance solutions?
I appreciate the question, Senator. Years ago, I spoke about the problems that folks in La Plata and Montezuma counties and Senator Gardner's state were getting. Even though they're in Colorado, they were getting Albuquerque programming that wasn't relevant to them. Congress has given us some authority in this space to modify markets, and we've processed those market modification applications very quickly in most cases, and we'd be happy to work with you on your legislation to make sure that Packer fans in the future only have to worry about who is going to step out at number 3 behind Randall Cobb and Devontae Adams, or how Jimmy Graham's going to be used in the red zone, or whether Aaron Jones is going to be the lead back. I say this as a fantasy football fan with a great amount of interest in these particular issues, so happy to work with you on that legislation.
Okay. So I want to also say that I'm glad to see continued federal investments to support rural broadband deployment. Like many of my colleagues, I had roundtable discussions during our week-long recess last week on this very issue and heard, again, stories that are so infuriating. Wisconsin gets cold in the winter. I heard from a young person who actually does homework in the parking lot of the school because that's the only way that they can get the broadband after school hours. So we've heard a lot of discussion about the map and whether we are going to be able to marshal our scarce resources wisely to help areas that are truly unserved or underserved. I think that the federal government can and should do more to bear the burden of having accurate maps. And Commissioner Rosenworcel, you have taken a real interest in this issue. What I want to just observe is that in rural parts of my state, federal agencies operate every day, from the Postal Service to the Forest Service to the Army Corps of Engineers. I can name others. And it seems to me that they could help contribute to our knowledge of what's truly available to consumers there. I wonder if you have any comments about that in terms of asking the broader federal government to collect accurate data on broadband service and particularly wireless coverage.
Yes, Senator. Our effort to map where broadband is and is not in this country should not begin and end here in Washington. We have got to go out to the American public and try to figure out how they can help us crowdsource this activity. We should be using our FCC field resources as well, and we should look at other resources, even postal trucks that traverse rural America. Why can't we outfit them with the kind of spectrum equipment that would allow us to learn where wireless service is and is not? We need to be innovative and creative because we need the best data possible to fix this problem.
Okay, why can't we?
I would be happy to work with you and my colleagues over here on that, should you want to.
One just note for the record, I was going to ask about consumer education for the broadcast repack, and I just wanted to share the story of the Milwaukee PBS station in Wisconsin completed their channel change earlier this year and developed a full-scale marketing campaign entitled Plan to Scan. It utilized social and traditional media, and they staffed a phone bank to answer questions and walk their viewers through the process of rescanning their television sets. Calls on average lasted 30 minutes as each viewer needed assistance to understand how to rescan. I basically want to have you take this information from Milwaukee's PBS station to understand that this is a significant undertaking for consumers. And Chairman Pai, I was pleased to see the FCC issue an NPRM on utilizing the consumer education funds provided by Congress. How will the Commission incorporate the experiences of broadcasters like Milwaukee PBS in their rulemaking?
Thanks for the question, Senator. I think part of it is hearing stories like the one you just related, and we'd be interested in learning more about Milwaukee PBS in particular and any other stations that have similar experiences. And we're grateful to Congress for providing that $50 million or so of funding for consumer education, and our goal is to do something that was similar to what we did with DTVs, to make folks aware of this entire process and give them the answers they need. So we'd love to work with you on that effort.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Go Pack. Senator Cruz is up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to each of you. Thank you for being here. Let me say, first of all, Chairman Pai, I wanted to thank you for your leadership, in particular in stepping forward with the Commission and repealing the Obama FCC's net neutrality rules. That has been a topic of much discussion, including enormous hyperbole. Indeed, we heard that the world was going to end when the net neutrality rules were repealed, notwithstanding the fact that they had been implemented only in 2015, so for the entire history of the Internet, the FCC had not declared the authority to regulate prices and terms of service on the Internet, other than for the 2 years of that unlawful power grab. Nonetheless, with an abundance of misinformation, many people of good conscience were told that somehow eliminating regulation of the Internet by the federal government would imperil their freedom. So let me ask you, now that those rules have been repealed, has the Internet ceased to function?
It is not, Senator.
And the parade of horribles that people were told, have those parade of horribles, is there any evidence that any of them have come to pass?
They have not, and moreover, even if one or two or many were, we now have in place an FCC transparency rule and FTC enforcement to make sure that it would be addressed quickly.
Well, I want to commend you for having the courage to do that, because there was a lot of political animus, nastiness, and misinformation, and much of that was directed at you personally and your family. And I want to say thank you publicly for serving and enduring that kind of grief. I believe that our family should be off limits, and for anyone to be targeting particularly kids is inappropriate. So thank you for your service, and I appreciate, I'm a big believer in keeping the Internet free, and keeping it free from taxation, keeping it free from regulation, allowing it to be an oasis of free speech and entrepreneurial freedom. And I believe the decision that the FCC made to end that power grab by Washington was the right decision and was consistent with law. Let's shift to a different topic, which is 5G. Earlier this month, Deloitte released a report entitled 5G, the Chance to Lead for a Decade. The report highlights that, quote, since 2015, China has outspent the U.S. by approximately $24 billion in wireless communication infrastructure, and has built 350,000 new sites, while the U.S. has built fewer than 30,000. Looking forward, China's 5-year economic plan specifies $400 billion in 5G-related investment. Consequently, China and other countries may be creating a 5G tsunami, making it near impossible to catch up. So that was Deloitte's conclusion. Do you share that assessment, that it may be near impossible to catch up with China on 5G?
Appreciate the question, Senator. I believe the U.S. is leading on 5G with respect to spectrum. We're holding major auctions at the end of this year and then the second half of next year. With respect to infrastructure over short-sighted opposition, we've been modernizing our rules to make sure that any small cell deployment doesn't have to jump through federal, state, local, and in some cases tribal hoops. That is an effort that is absolutely necessary. You will never get 5G infrastructure at scale if you have these multiple levels of regulatory review, which China, for obvious reasons, doesn't observe. So I think it's critical for us to modernize our rules to assert U.S. leadership in 5G.
So what are the barriers, regulatory or otherwise, that have been standing in the way of deployment of 5G infrastructure?
Senator, I think that by far the biggest one has been our infrastructure policies. These policies were developed for another age, another kind of infrastructure. They were designed for big cell towers, not multiplicity of small cells. In addition, as I said, we've had a history in this country for a variety of reasons for multiple levels of regulatory review. The most powerful thing this Congress could do, frankly, with respect to the Internet is to adhere to the 5-word phrase that Chairman Thune used in his opening remarks, the borderless nature of Internet access. The FCC has long found that the Internet is inherently an interstate service. It follows from that, then, that the FCC should be able to establish a consistent, uniform system of regulation. So long as we have multiple bites of the regulatory apple and the regulatory uncertainty that flows from that, we will always be behind those countries that have established a national policy on 5G.
Okay, and so last question. As you're aware, a report came out from the National Security Council suggesting the possibility of nationalizing 5G. And indeed, there have been others who have expressed possible support for that. Personally, I think that's a terrible idea. And as you know, I've introduced legislation, bipartisan legislation with Senator Cortez Masto, to make clear that the federal government cannot nationalize 5G absent explicit congressional authorization. The question I wanted to ask Chairman Pai, but actually to each of the four of you, do any of you disagree that nationalizing 5G would be a mistake?
I do not, Senator. I've consistently said that I believe the market, not government, is best positioned to drive innovation and investment in this area.
No, I support your legislation.
Thank you.
Nationalizing networks is not the path forward. We won the race to 4G based on the free market, and that's the path to 5G as well.
I agree with my colleagues on this.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. And that was remarkable. You end and get everybody on the same page. Kumbaya. That's right. All right, good. Well, I think we've pretty much covered all the bases, and we appreciate very much the members of the commission for being here. This, as you know, is a critical part of what we do here in terms of oversight, and appreciate your responses to the questions. We will have additional questions that will be submitted by members for the record, and we'll keep the hearing record open for a couple of weeks and hope that you all will get any responses to those questions back as quickly as possible. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for enduring the slings and arrows of being in public life, as was noted, that sometimes there are lines that get crossed by people that shouldn't get crossed when it comes to the work that our officials do. And so we appreciate your willingness and your family's willingness to engage in this sometimes difficult and challenging business. But there is so much in front of the commission, so many things that you deal with that profoundly impact and affect the lives of every American. And so we want to make sure we do everything we can to work with you to see that we get it right. So thank you again, and with that, we'll conclude this hearing. It's adjourned.